Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. There are places in the woods where the rain doesn't sound like weather anymore. It sounds like footsteps, like breathing, like something circling just outside the thin walls you trust to keep the dark away. And if you've ever been alone in a tent, listening to the storm and telling yourself you're safe, then tonight's stories are going to stay with you longer than you want them to. Because tonight, we're not talking about ordinary campfire scares. We're talking about abandoned bridges that lower something into the dark, voices that answer from the spruce, lights that wait for you to look at them, and things that don't knock before they come in. Deep in these forests, the silence isn't empty, it's listening. And once something out there notices you, the worst part isn't getting lost, it's realizing you were never alone to begin with. I can still feel the heat of a breath that didn't belong to a living thing pressing through a thin sheet of nylon against my cheek. It wasn't the warmth of a person, but a humid, heavy exhalation that smelled of stagnant creek water and old, wet earth. Most people think the woods are dangerous because of what hides in the shadows, but the real terror is when the shadows stop hiding and start circling. I am not a man who scares easily, and I am certainly not a novice in the backcountry. I grew up in Elkins, just 30 miles from the National Forest boundary in West Virginia. By 20, I had logged more nights under a canopy of hemlocks than most people spend in their entire lives. I know the language of the forest. I can tell the difference between a bear crashing through a thicket and a dead branch giving way under its own weight. I know the specific, rhythmic drumming of rain on different grades of nylon and the way a creek changes its tune as the water rises. I've always preferred the silence of the woods to the noise of people. There is a certain comfort in a loneliness that you choose for yourself, a feeling of total autonomy where the only rules are the ones dictated by nature. I don't seek sympathy for my isolation. I seek the clarity it provides. But that night in September of 2022, in the Monongah, that clarity became a weapon used against me. The trip was a standard solo overnighter. I parked at a pull-off south of Durban and hiked a mile into the timber to a spot I'd used a dozen times before. It was a flat bench of ground perched above a small creek, sheltered on three sides by a stand of ancient, towering hemlocks. On the fourth side, the land dropped away in a gentle, grassy slope toward the water. The creek was low, barely a foot across, running clear over smooth stones with a quiet, musical trickle. I went through my routine with the mechanical precision of a seasoned hiker. I pitched my tent on the flattest section of the bench, strung my food bag high between two trees, and cooked a simple meal on my camp stove. As the light shifted from gold to a bruised purple, and finally to a suffocating black, I sat on a log and listened to the forest breathe. I noticed the air felt unusually heavy, a thick, cloying humidity that seemed to cling to the back of my throat. The forecast had called for rain, and in these mountains, that usually means a gamble between a drizzle and a deluge. I had waterproofed my seams, packed a heavy-duty ground cloth, and secured my clothes in a dry bag. By 8 o'clock, the first drops began to hit the rainfly, a gentle patter that signaled the start of a comfortable night. I crawled into my sleeping bag with a headlamp and a paperback, feeling the familiar safety of my small, nylon sanctuary. Within 30 minutes, the rain shifted from a patter to a violent downpour. The fabric of the tent began to thrum like a drum skin, vibrating through my spine as the wind whipped through the hemlocks. Below me, the musical trickle of the creek transformed into a muscular roar, a wall of white noise that should have lured me into a deep sleep. Instead, I found myself wide awake, gripped by a low-level alertness that I couldn't name. I lay there in the dark, headlamp off, listening to the layers of the storm. There was the rain, the wind, and the rushing water. And then, underneath it all, so faint that I had to stop my own heart to hear it, there was something else. Footsteps. I know how humans walk in the woods. We are irregular. We stumble over roots, we crunch through dry leaves, we shift our weight as we navigate uneven terrain. But these footsteps were different. They were perfectly, metronomically even. Each step landed with the exact same weight and duration as the one before it, like a clock ticking in the mud. They were heavy, not the heaviness of a large person, but the heaviness of something pressing into the earth with a force that defied its perceived size. I could feel the impacts through the floor of the tent, a dull thud that resonated in my chest. They were circling me. I lay frozen in my sleeping bag, counting the seconds as the sound moved in a slow, deliberate loop around the perimeter of my campsite. One circuit took exactly 45 seconds. I counted every single step, my mind racing to find a rational explanation. A bear walking upright? No, bears don't walk in perfect circles with the precision of a wind-up toy. A confused hiker? No one walks barefoot through a West Virginia deluge at 10 at night with a mechanical stride. The more I analyzed the sound, the more the logic of the world began to fray. Then came the second circuit. As I tracked the sound moving from the hemlocks toward the creek, I realized the radius had tightened. Whatever was out there had closed the distance by 2 or 3 feet, spiraling inward toward the center of the bench. The sounds became more intimate, more visceral. I could hear the wet earth compressing under a massive weight and a faint, sickening sucking noise as mud released a foot, and then I heard the breathing. It was low, steady, and regular, suggesting a chest cavity far larger than a human's. It wasn't labored or excited. It was the autonomic function of something that was completely unhurried. It was the breathing of a predator that knows the prey has nowhere to go. The third circuit brought it even closer, maybe 10 feet from the tent walls. Now, the breathing had a quality that made the hair on my arms stand up. It was wet, not the sound of a cold or a congested chest, but the sound of a mouth held wide open while rain falls directly into it. It sounded like something that had forgotten how to close its mouth, or perhaps something that didn't possess the instinct to do so. I did everything my 20 years of experience taught me to do. I stayed still, I stayed quiet, I did not engage. This is the protocol for bears, for bobcats, for the rare mountain lion. You make yourself small and uninteresting, and you wait for the animal to lose interest. But as the fourth circuit began, I realized with a jolt of pure adrenaline that this was not an animal. Animals are curious. This thing was invested. The fourth pass didn't circle. The footsteps stopped dead, directly outside my door flap. 6 inches of ripstop nylon were all that separated me from the thing in the rain. I watched in absolute horror as the fabric of the tent pressed inward. It wasn't a gust of wind. It was a slow, steady pressure, as if something were leaning its weight against the door, testing the resistance of the poles and the give of the material. A circular indentation appeared in the fabric, about the size of a palm, centered 3 feet above the ground. It held there, patient and unwavering. Then the warmth hit me. A long, slow exhalation pressed through the nylon and touched my skin, a ghost of a breath that felt humid and ancient. I have never been that still in my entire life. My body went into a biological override, every muscle locking into a rigid state of terror. I was no longer a backpacker or an expert of the woods. I was a piece of meat in a nylon bag. I lay there for 5 minutes, maybe an hour, time having lost all meaning, while that thing leaned against my shelter and breathed on my face. I could hear the rain roaring and the creek screaming, but in the center of that chaos was a silence so heavy it felt like it was crushing the air out of my lungs. Then, the pressure vanished. The fabric sprang back. I heard a single step back, then another, and then the metronomic stride resumed. It didn't circle this time. It walked in a straight line, moving with sudden, terrifying purpose toward the creek. I listened as the soft thuds of earth turned into the heavy splashes of something wading into a flooded stream. The current was fast enough to move boulders, but the footsteps didn't falter. The rhythm remained perfect, the stride unchanged by the rushing water, until the sound faded into the distance and the forest returned to the sound of the rain. I didn't sleep. I lay there until the gray, oppressive light of morning filtered through the clouds and made the world look solid again. The moment I could see, I scrambled out of the tent. My campsite was a disaster. My stove had been knocked over and my ground cloth was skewed, but I didn't care about the gear. I was looking at the mud. There they were. 4 concentric rings of footprints pressed into the soft earth, tracing the exact spiral I had heard through the night. They were bare feet, but they were not human. I wear a size 11. These prints were 16, maybe 17 inches long. The toes were the worst part. They weren't blunt. They were long and tapered, extending forward like fingers, spread wide to grip the mud. The stride was impossible. Each print was separated by nearly 4 feet, a distance that would require a creature well over 7 feet tall to achieve at a walking pace. I followed the trail toward the creek, my heart hammering against my ribs. The prints led in a straight line, getting deeper as the ground sloped, and then they entered the water. I crossed the creek and searched the far bank for an hour. I walked 100 yards in both directions, scanning every inch of the mud and every broken branch. The prints entered the water on one side, but they never emerged on the other. There was no disturbed earth, no broken vegetation, nothing. Whatever had circled my tent had simply ceased to exist the moment it stepped into the current. I packed my gear in 15 minutes. I didn't eat, I didn't filter my water, and I didn't look back. I drove straight to Elkins and sat in a Walmart parking lot for an hour, surrounded by fluorescent lights and the mindless hum of shoppers. I needed to be in a world that operated by rules I understood, a world where a foot is a foot and a breath is just air. I've been back to the Monongah since then, but I never go back to that site. And I never camp near a creek if the forecast calls for rain. It's not that I think the rain creates these things, it's that the rain reveals them. I told my story to an old man in Elkins, a man who had spent 80 years in those hollows. He didn't laugh. He didn't tell me it was a bear. He just looked at me with a profound, weary sadness. He told me that the old people used to say there are things in the deep hollows that only come out when it rains. To them, the rain is like a door. There is something about the sound, the saturation of the earth, or the way the veil thins when the world is wet, that allows them to move through spaces they normally cannot reach. He said they travel through the water, using the creeks as highways to enter our world. I asked him what they were, and he just shook his head. He said they don't have a name in English, or any language we know. They are just the things that come out when it rains. He told me they aren't necessarily malicious. They are just curious. They circle because they are trying to understand what we are, trying to map the boundaries of a creature that doesn't belong in the deep hollows. But then he told me the part that keeps me awake every time a storm rolls in. He said the most important rule is to stay in your tent, to stay still, and to let them finish their circles. He warned me never to follow the prints to the creek. He told me that the prints always go into the water, but they never come out. And sometimes, he whispered, the people who follow the prints don't come out either. I remember looking at those finger-like toes in the mud, and I remember the way the creature had leaned against my tent, testing the fabric. I realized then that it wasn't just curious about me. It was measuring me. It was feeling the thickness of the nylon and the fragility of my bones, calculating exactly how much pressure it would take to break through. Now, whenever I hear the rain start to thrum against my roof at home, I don't feel safe. I think about that humid, wet breath and the metronomic sound of those heavy feet. I think about the fact that I followed those prints to the water's edge, and for a few minutes, I stood on the bank, staring into the current, waiting for something to emerge. I didn't realize it then, but by following the trail, I had answered the creature's curiosity. I had shown it the way back. The rain is starting again now. It's a gentle patter on the window, a rhythmic, musical sound. But as I sit here in the silence of my room, I can hear something else. Underneath the sound of the storm, there is a heavy, slow thud in the hallway. 1 step, 2 steps, perfectly, metronomically even. And then I feel it. A slow, humid warmth pressing against the back of my neck, and the smell of stagnant creek water filling the room. Something was being lowered toward us in the dark, one link at a time, and neither of us was brave enough to unzip the tent and look. I remember the exact weight of that decision, the way it sat on my chest, heavier than the rain, heavier than the bridge above us. My name is not important. What matters is that I am the one who agreed to move camp uphill when the river flooded. I am the one who chose the flat ground beneath the abandoned railroad bridge. And Nate, my closest friend since our Forest Service days, trusted me the way he had trusted me on a dozen trips before. We had planned the Cranberry River trip all summer, spreading a topo map across his kitchen table in Marlington, tracing brook trout water and gravel bars with the tips of our beer bottles. 3 days, 2 nights, an easy hike south from the campground. We were both in our mid-30s now, both carrying more weight and less certainty than we used to. The woods were where we still felt like ourselves. That is the part I keep circling back to, because I was the one who wanted this trip more than he did. Friday afternoon, the forecast broke. A soaking rain came down out of the northwest, and the river climbed a foot in an hour, chewing across our gravel bar toward the tents. We packed wet and bushwhacked the slope, cursing every route, until we found the only flat ground for a quarter mile. It sat in the shadow of an old logging railroad bridge, a steel truss skeleton 40 feet above the water, the rails long gone, the ties rotted through in places, so you could see the river moving between them. I noticed 3 things when we set up. The concrete abutments were stained dark with mineral seep. The rusted trusses hummed faintly when the wind moved through them. And there was a narrow footpath worn into the earth beside the nearest pillar, the kind of path deer do not make. Nate joked about the bridge looking like the rib cage of something enormous. He was always the one who could turn a bad night into a good story. We cooked rice and canned chili under a tarp strung between the abutments, drank instant coffee, and by 10 we were both zipped into our tents, with the rain layering itself across nylon and steel and river like a slow percussion. I checked my watch before I closed my eyes, 10:32. The next time I looked, it was 12:14, and I was wide awake and something above us was moving. It started at the far end of the bridge. A scraping, low and metallic, the sound of something heavy being pulled across steel, not the random clatter of wind. Deliberate, measured, the rhythm of a chain dragged link by link across cross members, each one catching and clanking over the next. It crossed the deck slowly, from the far hillside toward our side, and when it reached the center, the point directly above our tents, it stopped. I lay there staring at the pale ceiling of my tent, waiting for the sound to become something I could name. Wind, a cable, a branch, anything. Instead, a new sound began. A metallic uncoiling, the unmistakable feed of chain paying out from a pile, link by link, dropping through the gaps in the rotted deck, being lowered, not falling, lowered at a controlled, patient pace, the way a fisherman feeds line into deep water. I did the math because thinking was the only thing my body would still let me do. 40 feet of air between the deck and the ground, a foot every few seconds. After 3 minutes, the bottom of it would be 15 feet above us. Then 10. The links were getting louder as the chain grew heavier, each one arriving with a deeper resonance, and I could hear Nate move in the tent beside mine, the rustle of a sleeping bag, the soft compression of a man sitting up in the dark and deciding not to speak. The sound stopped. The last link clinked into place and the chain hung there. I could not see it. I could hear it, the faint rhythmic creak of heavy metal swaying in the wind, back and forth, the same tired sound an old gate makes on its hinges. It was hanging directly above the space between our tents. I could feel it. That is the part I cannot explain cleanly. The way you feel a large object near you in a dark room, the displacement of air, the pressure of weight suspended somewhere above your face. My body knew where it was even when my eyes could not confirm. Nate whispered through the rain, "You hear that?" It was not a question. I said yes. That was the entire conversation. We did not move. Not because we were frozen, though fear was part of it, but because unzipping the tent meant standing up and looking, and neither of us was willing to look. So we lay there while the chain swung, and after a while I became aware of a second quality to the sound. Beneath the metal creak there was a low, sustained vibration, almost subsonic, that traveled down through the chain into the abutments, into the ground and up through the floor of my tent, and into the hollow behind my eyes. I felt it in my teeth. It was not a sound, it was a pressure. I lost time in there. I know I did, because when I next checked my watch it read 3:11, and I had no memory of the hour before it. Just the swinging, just the pressure, and a slow certainty settling into me that whatever was on the end of that chain was not moving because of the wind. It was moving because it was listening, adjusting, positioning itself over the gap between us, correcting its aim. I thought about Nate, 15 feet away, lying in the same posture I was in, and I felt a shame that made no sense in the moment and makes perfect sense now. I had picked this spot. I had said, "This will do." I had looked up at the ribcage of rusted steel and thought only about drainage and flat ground. I had not looked up at what a bridge is, which is a thing built to hold weight above you. The rain eased around 5. The sky graded from black to gray, and somewhere in the last hour the creaking had faded, so gradually I could not name the moment it stopped. I unzipped my tent. Nate was already out, standing at the base of the nearest abutment, looking up. The bridge was empty. Rusted trusses, rotted ties, gray sky visible through the gaps in the deck. No chain, no rope, no cable. Nothing hanging, nothing coiled, nothing draped. The bridge was exactly what it had been when we arrived. I was turning back toward my tent when Nate said, "Wait." He was staring at the concrete face of the abutment at eye level. I stepped closer, scratched into the mineral stain, cut deep enough to expose clean pale concrete beneath. Was a date, fresh, the concrete dust still sitting in the grooves. It was yesterday's date, the date we had arrived, the date we had camped beneath the bridge and listened to a chain descend toward us in the dark. We packed in silence and hiked out in the drizzle. The 45-minute drive back to Marlington passed in almost complete quiet, until Nate finally said the thing I had been trying not to think. That bridge has been abandoned since the 60s. Nobody goes up there. The date on the concrete was cut from the outside face of the abutment, a face you can only reach by climbing down over the edge of the deck. Whoever carved it did it during the night. While we were lying in our tents, they knew we were there. They knew the date, and they wanted to leave a record that we had been there too. That is the sentence I cannot put down. The record, not a threat, not a warning, a notation, the kind of mark you make when you are keeping. I looked up the bridge later, and the rail line it served. 3 men died during construction in 1908. A logger fell from the deck in 1923. A hiker went missing in the drainage in 1991 and was found a week later downstream, drowned, though the water at the time was barely knee-deep. Each event has a date. Each date is a mark on a timeline. I think about the narrow footpath worn into the earth beside that abutment. The one I noticed when we set up and told myself was made by deer. Deer do not carve dates. Someone walks that path. Someone walks it often enough to keep it clear. I think about the faint hum I heard in the trusses when the wind moved through them, before anything had happened, before the chain, before the pressure behind my eyes. I think it was not the wind. I think the bridge was already occupied when we arrived, and whatever occupied it was deciding whether we counted. And I think about the restraint. That is the part that keeps me up. Whatever lowered itself toward us that night had the patience to feed the chain link by link across 3 minutes of darkness. It had the precision to stop directly between our tents. It could have come the rest of the way. It chose not to. It only wanted to be close enough to measure us, close enough to know the shape of what was breathing below it, and then it wanted to leave the date. Nate and I still camped together. We went to Dolly Sod's last month, 3 days of clear weather and good fishing. We do not talk about the Cranberry River, but I noticed him walking a slow, wide circle around the clearing before he set his tent, his eyes going up into the canopy, checking every branch, every dead limb. When I asked what he was looking for, he said, "Nothing, just making sure there is nothing overhead." I did not tell him what I found last week, when I finally forced myself to open the photographs on my phone. I zoomed in on the picture I took of the abutment that morning. Below our date, faint and older, weathered nearly smooth, were other dates, a column of them, some from years I recognized, some from years before I was born, and at the very bottom, so eroded I almost missed it, a date 3 weeks in the future. I have not gone back to check whether the carving is still there. I have not decided whether checking would be worse than not checking. What I know is that something was above us that night, and we were beneath it, and it had the patience to lower itself toward us, 1 link at a time, and the restraint to stop. The only evidence it left was a date, ours, and one waiting. You cannot outlisten someone who spends 12 hours a day sitting 3 feet from a teenager whose ribs are showing under a thrift store hoodie. You develop a frequency in your ears like old television static on Channel 3. After 15 years in a Summersville High School guidance office, I know the exact pitch where a voice stops being sad and starts being structural. It is the sound of a load-bearing wall cracking at 3 in the morning. That was why the hollow outside Richwood Looked like a blueprint for peace when I found it on the topo map in January. 3 ridges meeting in a tight bowl, 200 feet down, dead centered on a little creek where the hemlocks grow so thick the satellite feed turns to mush. I needed a hole that didn't talk back. I needed a ceiling of green needles that caught the rain before it hit my skin and turned it into white noise. I packed 3 things that should have warned me: a compass I hadn't calibrated in 4 years, a wool blanket that still smelled like my father's garage before he went flat and quiet, and a notebook with 17 blank pages at the back. Detail 1, though I did not underline it, I bought 2 loaves of sandwich bread at the Save-A-Lot in Richwood and left one on the passenger seat under a jacket, unrefrigerated, because I intended to be back by Sunday noon. Bread goes sour in 4 days if you forget it. Detail 2. The game trail into the bowl did not go down. It went in like someone had sewn a seam in the hillside and then pulled the thread loose. Detail 3 was the little iron ring I found wedged between 2 roots at the trailhead, rusted flat into the bark like an old belt buckle. I kicked it once, decided it was logging junk from the Eisenhower administration, and dropped it into my side pocket to save some dog's paw later. By 4 o'clock, the light was the color of a bruised kidney. Hemlock does that to an afternoon. It steals the gold and leaves only the green grease. I strung the hammock 50 yards from the creek because water sounds like company when you are lonely and like artillery when you are tired. The tarp went up taut, 6 feet of nylon between me and Nicholas County. When the rain hit at 10, it did not arrive as weather. It arrived as architecture. The bowl shaped the drop like a megaphone, and suddenly I was inside a drum. That was when the child started. Not crying out, crying in, like someone had placed a small, wet face against the nylon 3 inches from my left ear and exhaled. I waited for the second breath. If it is human, the second breath is longer because the first one was stolen by surprise. Instead came a dry, rhythmic hitch. Haha. The sound up to 7-year-old makes when they have cried so hard their tongue feels like salt beef. I stayed flat. My hips didn't move. In my office, when a kid does that particular stutter, you do not lean forward or offer a tissue. You let the silence get wide enough for them to drop something heavy into it. I said, "Hey," into the dark between my nose and the tarp. The crying cut off with a wet click, the way a wet tongue leaves a glass. 10 seconds, then 20. The rain on the hemlocks was so loud my teeth felt loose in the gum, a vibrating frequency like an old bridge when a semi rolls over. Then the same hitch started again, slightly off-center, 10 feet closer, or perhaps not closer in space, just louder in definition, as if someone had turned up the gain on a microphone hidden in my collarbone. I put my boots on inside the bag because taking them off had been an act of faith I no longer possessed. My right lace was knotted into a small, hard walnut of mud. I broke it with my thumb. When I dropped my feet to the needles, the ground didn't squish. It gave way with a small pop like a blister opening under wool. The beam of my headlamp was 1,000-lumen white, the kind that turned spider eyes into diamond studs. It didn't pierce the bowl. It carved a tunnel through greasy air that smelled of wet horsehair and old lime. There was nothing at 30 feet except 3 trunks of hemlock scarred by lightning back when Nixon had hair. I walked toward the silence where the crying had been, because silence after a child's sob is never neutral. It is an empty chair. At 50 feet, the ground flattened out into a shelf where the creek made a hairpin. The water looked thick, like lard melting in a pan. The crying started again behind a thicket of rhododendron that didn't have any business being green this late in the year. Same note, same cadence. 2 short pulls, 1 long drop. It was too regular. Human lungs have corners. This sounded like a small bellows operated by someone who was paid by the hour. I shined the light down into the leaves. Nothing, not even a toad. Then the voice said, not loud, not whispered, just near. He took the red one. My hand twitched on the barrel. I don't have a red coat. I don't own anything red except a Bic pen. Who did? I asked the leaves. The voice didn't answer. It just restarted the hitch, only now it was coming from upstream, where the contour lines on my topo map got so close together they looked like fingerprints. People who don't work with kids think fear is an escalation. It isn't. It's a series of plateaus where you suddenly realize you forgot how to spell your middle name. I stood knee-deep in fern fronds that felt like wet feathers and tried to remember what my brother looked like when we were 12. All I got was the back of his neck and a scab that wouldn't heal because he kept picking it during algebra. The rain turned from water to grease. It stopped splashing and started smearing. Every time I swung the light, the beam didn't hit trees. It hit slabs of dark green that looked like they had been painted yesterday. I hadn't checked my watch since camp, which meant either 20 minutes had passed or the batteries in my headlamp were dying from the inside. They weren't dying. They were getting brighter. That is the first sign the air has gone thick with something besides mist. The LEDs start throwing violet rims around the wet bark. I found the second iron ring at 70 paces. It was wedged between two stones by the creek, identical to the first, except this one had a scrap of blue nylon threaded through the eye. Not my tent blue, department store blue, the kind they use for cheap backpacks that fall apart the second year of middle school when the books get thick. "Stop," I told the dark. My voice sounded thin, like someone shouting through a sweater. The crying didn't stop. It dropped an octave. It went from a small girl to a small boy who had given up on being found and was now just keeping score. It wasn't moving away anymore. It was orbiting. I could tell by the way the echoes didn't bounce off the ridge. They bounced off me. Every time I turned my left ear, the dry hitch hit the flat cartilage like a pebble. I sat down on a mossy log because my knees felt like they'd been filled with wet sand. This is the vocational hazard. You spend 10 years telling kids, it's okay to not be okay, until you forget that some things are not okay because they are actually standing behind you with a clipboard. "You're too old," I said to the ferns. The breathing started. Not behind me. Under me, it was slow. 4 seconds in, 6 seconds out. Not lungs, bellows, like someone was squeezing a leather bag full of damp leaves every time I tried to exhale. I didn't jump. I just leaned forward until my forehead touched the bark, cold and smelling of old ants. Durit 1. The bread flashed through my head like a grocery receipt. It was sitting on the seat of the Honda. By now, the crusts would be sticking to the plastic. By tomorrow morning, the yeast would smell like vinegar. By Tuesday, it would be bread no longer, just a gray pelt to B2, the seam. It wasn't a trail. It was a zipper. You don't walk into a bowl of 3 ridges. You fall into the lap of something that doesn't care if you brought snacks. Detail 3 was the iron ring. Not a belt buckle, a tether. I reached out blindly to my left and touched something that wasn't a tree. It was cold, rounded, and ribbed like a drain pipe, except when my thumb slid down it, I felt a seam. Not a bark seam, a weld. When I clicked the flashlight off to save the battery, the dark didn't come in. It settled. It had weight. I could feel it on my eyelids like wool blankets stored in a damp basement. "Mr. Miller," the voice said. It didn't use the child's voice. It used mine from 3 years ago, before the divorce papers were notarized, when I still called my mother on Sundays to tell her about the weather in Nicholas County. It sounded tired. It sounded like a man who had eaten a ham sandwich over a heap of disciplinary referrals while the clock on the wall made that little clack tick. That sounds like someone dropping a pebble down a well. I stayed still for 400 heartbeats. I counted them because if I stopped at 399, I would have to start over from 0, and 0 was where the thing with the bellows lived. "You're late," the voice said. Not "where have you been?" Not "help me." Just an administrative observation. Like a principal poking his head into room 104 during 5th period to see why nobody is reading The Crucible. I stood up without using my hands. My knees made a dry clack that sounded like a stapler. I walked back toward camp the way I walked down the hall after telling a mother her son was going to finish his junior year in a cinderblock cell. Straight, fast, and without looking at the bulletin boards. The trees didn't move. They just let me through the way an old crowd lets through a man carrying a box of files. The hammock was still there, which was the first mistake. Things that let you come back usually do so because they want to see if you brought anything else. I didn't get in. I sat on the ground under the tarp with my knees against my chin and watched the water drip off the nylon into a puddle that was beginning to look less like mud and more like a basin. The bread was waiting for me. Not the physical bread. That was 3 miles up on Route 39. The idea of it. The square, white, tasteless slices that parents buy when they can't afford meat between the layers. Every child I'd ever had in that chair for 40 minutes of mandatory talk about attendance had that bread in their lunchbox. It gets soggy by third period. It tastes like wet cotton. By fourth period, they don't even trade it. They just leave it on the library table behind the encyclopedias. I realized what the hollow was. It wasn't an acoustic anomaly. An anomaly is an accident of limestone. This thing had corners, not right angles. Just places where the sound changed its shoes. The crying started again around 4. Not rain crying now, dry crying. The kind you do when you've told the truth to the wrong person and now you have to live through the rest of the afternoon. I signed the slip, I said to the dark. The hitch stopped. Not a click this time. A drag, like someone pulling a sack of flour across rough floorboards. You didn't check the box, the voice said. My fingers went to my pocket. I still had the iron ring. I pulled it out and rubbed the flat side against my thumb until the rust came off orange. It wasn't logging junk. It was the eyelet from an old gym bag. One of the ones we gave out in 2012 when the grant money came through for after-school sports. The third detail, the one I thought was just local color, was the smell. Not hemlock. Not grease. Laundered cotton dried over a gas heater in a basement where the walls weep white salt. I didn't go back to Summersville on Sunday. I drove down to the creek at the bottom of the bowl again, at 8 in the morning, after the mist had burned off into that flat gray ceiling that looks like old aluminum siding. The water wasn't clear. It was oily with pollen. The third ring was 20 feet further down than it had been at midnight. It wasn't wedged. It was set, like a stake. I knelt down in the mud, not caring about the knees anymore, because once you've worn the trousers through, what's the point? And looked under the flat stone where the water was deepest. There was no skeleton. There was no boot. Just a composition notebook with the cover curled back like a tongue. I didn't open it. I know what's on page 4 because I wrote it during third period study hall when Kevin Vance wouldn't stop clicking his mechanical pencil. He is not coming back. Tell him the red one is gone. The breathing didn't start today. It didn't need to. It's in the seat pocket of my Honda. When I turned the key 20 minutes ago, the heater blew warm air that smelled faintly of old wool and damp bread. I haven't told my brother. He's an engineer. He'd want to measure the bowl. He'd bring a plumb bob. He'd stand where I stood and listen to the hemlocks and tell me about the lapse rate. He wouldn't hear the stapler. Every time I start the car now, I wait for the huh before the radio kicks on. It usually comes around the 3rd-mile marker, right where the road drops into the shade of the ridge. Not a child. Never a child. Just a man who has listened to enough small voices to know that after a while, they don't need you to help them home. They just need you to leave the door unlocked so they don't have to break the glass again. I bought 3 loaves yesterday. I put one on the dash, one on the floor, one in the trunk under the spare tire where it's dark and cool and nothing ever goes sour because nothing ever gets warm. If you drive through Nicholas County on a Tuesday, don't stop at the 3-way by the old lumber mill. The trees look like green wool until you get close enough to see the weave. And once you see the weave, you notice that every third needle has been tied into a little knot by someone who had too much time between bells and not enough paper to write it down. My office smells like cedar chips today. I don't know why. We don't have cedar. We have carpet that hasn't been cleaned since the first Bush administration. Kevin is sitting in the chair. He's looking at his shoes. He hasn't said a word in 20 minutes. I didn't ask him what's wrong. I just slid the red pen off the desk and dropped it into the gap between the cushions where the change goes. We have plenty of time. The rain isn't due until 4. The light came on the instant I looked at it and went dark the instant I looked away. I have replayed that night on Spruce Knob for 4 years, and I still cannot decide which of us was following the other. I was 29, solo on the Allegheny Trail in late October, camped on the ridge a mile south of the summit where the spruce grows stunted, and the wind has a way of making you feel like you are standing on the roof of the world even when the clouds are sitting on your head. The fog had dropped by 4, and by 7 my primary flashlight died in my hand with a flicker that felt personal. I had been putting off replacing that light for months because the switch had gotten unreliable, a little hitch before it caught that I had learned to work around. My backup was a smaller LED in a Ziploc bag with spare batteries, the kind of redundancy you bring when you tell yourself you are prepared for anything the mountain might do. I set up on a flat shelf I had used twice before, between two spruce trees, tarp low enough to break the wind and just wide enough to keep the rain off my pad. Dinner was rice and beans, eaten cross-legged on my pad while rain hit the nylon and dripped from branches like a slow metronome, and I told myself I was fine being alone up there. The rain never stopped. When the backup came on, the beam was tight and white, a clean cone that cut the fog in a way my primary never had, bleaching everything it touched. I swept it across the campsite the way you do automatically when you are suddenly in the dark, confirming the world was still where I left it. The light caught the tarp, the pack, the stove, the trunks, and then I swung it south along the ridge into gray nothing where the trail disappeared. Beyond 20 feet, everything was formless, just wet spruce and a circle of visibility that felt like a held breath. About 200 yards out, through rain that should have erased anything that far, a point of white appeared. It was not a campfire. It was sharp and steady, the size of a dime at arm's length. No flicker, no halo, no warmth. I held my beam on it for 2 seconds, and then pulled back to my boots out of reflex, because the instinct to check is strong when something should not be there. The light vanished cleanly, like a switch flipped, and the ridge was dark again except for the small circle of my tarp. I pointed back down the ridge, and it was there again, immediate and exact, as if it had been waiting for permission. I moved the beam left, and it vanished. Moved it right, and it vanished. Moved it back to center, and it returned. 6 deliberate tests, 6 perfect matches, each one erasing another explanation I was trying to hold on to. Whatever made that light was watching my beam, matching it with the immediacy of a mirror, except mirrors do not generate their own light. On the 7th test, I held steady, and the light held steady with me, and for 30 seconds we stared through rain and fog as if we were having a conversation I did not know the language for. It was the word that arrived uninvited and would not leave. Waiting. The light had been sitting in the dark in the rain and fog at a fixed point on the ridge, invisible until I swept my beam across it and gave it a reason to respond. My flashlight had found it, and now it was paying attention. That was when I felt the ridge shift from weather to something watching, and I knew the night had just changed. Then the light moved, not suddenly, not with the jerky motion of an animal or a person adjusting a flashlight, but slow and steady toward me along the ridge. It maintained the same brightness, the same elevation, the same unflickering quality, closing the distance with the unhurried confidence of something that had been waiting for me to look long enough. For 5 seconds I did not move under the tarp, the analytical part of my brain still offering explanations, while the older part told my body to run. I killed my flashlight. The darkness was immediate and absolute, and the light down the ridge vanished at the same instant as if our beams had been wired together. I sat in the dark under my tarp and listened to rain, wind, dripping spruce. Nothing else. No footsteps. No sound of approach. Just the weather and the mountain and the silence where the light had been. I packed my camp by feel, hands finding each item from memory and stuffing it into my pack with a speed that came from years of practice and a motivation that came from somewhere much older. Tarp down, pad rolled, bag stuffed, stove and fuel secured, all without a light because turning one on would mean being seen, and being seen would mean being answered. I did not want to be answered again. I hiked out in the dark 2 miles of ridge trail in the pouring rain with no light, navigating by the feel of the trail under my boots and the occasional touch of a spruce branch telling me I had drifted too close to the edge. The trail was a river of mud, and I slipped twice and fell once, catching myself on roots, and I did not stop. I did not turn around. I did not take out my flashlight. I walked with my eyes adjusted to absolute dark, which in fog and rain meant I could see almost nothing. I followed the trail by memory, and by the subtle differences in terrain my feet could detect through the soles of my boots. The trailhead took 45 minutes to reach. My truck was the only vehicle in the gravel lot. I threw my pack in the bed, got behind the wheel, started the engine, and sat there with the headlights on and the heater blasting and the wipers sweeping the rain from the windshield. The lot was small, carved into the edge of the spruce forest, surrounded by dark trees on 3 sides, and the gravel access road on the 4th. The headlights illuminated trees and rain and fog and nothing else. No point of white on the ridge. No indication that anything was up there except the weather and the empty trail I had just walked. I drove back to Elkins and I slept in my own bed. And I did not go back to Spruce Knob for over a year. When I finally did, on a clear day in summer, I hiked to the spot where I had camped and looked south along the ridge to the position where the light had been. There was nothing there, just ridge, open and treeless for a stretch, then a knob of spruce and rock, then the trail continuing south into the distance. No structure, no reflective surface, no explanation for a steady white light at that position, at that elevation. I told a few people about it and the responses were ball lightning, another hiker, fog playing tricks. I accepted all of those as possibilities because I am not someone who insists on the supernatural when the natural has not been fully explored. None of those explanations accounted for the responsiveness, the way the light appeared when I looked and disappeared when I looked away, the precision of a dance partner. That was the part that stayed, the interaction, the call and response. The sense that by sweeping my flashlight across the ridge I had initiated a communication I did not understand and could not control. On that clear summer day the ridge felt ordinary, the wind warm, the spruce bright, and I kept expecting the air to feel different where the light had been. It did not. The ground was the same, the trees the same, the sky was open enough that I could see into Virginia. I walked the flat shelf where I had slept and noticed how the two spruce trees framed a perfect sightline south, a natural tunnel that would have carried my beam straight to that point 200 yards out. I had chosen the spot twice before because it felt safe, because I knew it, and that familiarity had been a lie I told myself about being in control. The wind that had felt hostile in October was gentle now, and the gentleness made it worse. I still keep that backup light in the glove box of my truck, in the same Ziploc bag with the spare batteries, and I have not turned it on since that night. I tell myself it is because the batteries are probably dead, but the truth is, I am afraid of what will happen if I sweep a beam through fog again and something answers. The redundancy I brought because I was prepared was really a confession, a small admission that I was terrified of being left in the dark. The light on the ridge did not need spare batteries. It was steady, unflickering, patient, more reliable than the primary I had been nursing along for months. I replaced the primary light the next week, but I never threw the old one away. That unreliable switch had been hitching for months, and I had learned to work around it instead of replacing it, which is what I do with a lot of things. I wait for problems to become emergencies before I deal with them, and I wait for people to leave before I admit I am lonely. The light had been waiting too, sitting invisible until I gave it a reason to respond, and when I held my beam steady, it took that as an invitation to close the distance. I had sent a signal into the dark, and the dark had sent one back, and I had mistaken a response for an encounter. I have been trying to replace that part of myself ever since, with less success. Maybe it was a trick of fog and reflection, maybe it was someone else, maybe it was nothing at all, but the pattern was real and the pattern was mine. I test things. I sweep a beam across a room to confirm it is still there. I check my phone to confirm I am still connected. The ridge gave me a perfect mirror for that habit, a point of light that would only exist when I was looking, and disappear the moment I looked away. It was not stalking me, it was reflecting me, and the slow walk toward me was the part I could not accept, the moment the reflection decided to move. And when I held the beam steady, I was asking it to come closer, and it answered. I still dream about that 30 seconds when we stared, and in the dream the light never gets closer, it just holds. Sometimes I catch myself reaching for a flashlight in the house when the power flickers, and I pause with my hand on the switch, listening. The light comes on the instant I look at it, and goes dark the instant I look away, and I am starting to wonder if I ever really left Spruce Knob at all. It is waiting. It has always been waiting for me to look. The ridge is still there. The fog still comes down. The spruce still grows stunted. Something opened my tent from the outside, and I watched the zipper do it alone. I was 26, a wildland firefighter out of Richwood, and I was lying flat in my sleeping bag when the slider on my sealed door began sliding down its track, one tooth at a time, with the patience of a hand I could not see. The cranberry wilderness was my home ground. 35,000 acres of spruce and rhododendron with no roads, no buildings, no evidence that the century I was born into existed at all. I knew it the way you know a room in your own house, by feel more than by sight, and that knowing is exactly what let me walk in unafraid. The trip was supposed to be 3 days. I went in on a Tuesday in mid-October, hiking the Williams River Trail toward the headwaters, a boggy meadow at 4,000 feet where the river is born out of hillside springs. I had camped there 3 times, remote enough that I had never once seen another person, beautiful in that austere high-elevation way, gold grass, dark spruce, the smell of cold water and rotting leaves. I went into the backcountry to be alone. What I never admitted, even to myself, was how much the aloneness had started to feel like the only place I fit. The rain began the first afternoon. Not the scattered showers the forecast promised, but a steady soaking system that had nowhere else to be. By the time I reached the meadow, the trail behind me was a stream, and the ground was turning to shallow lake. I pitched on the highest rise at the edge of the spruce and strung my tarp over the vestibule for a dry place to cook. Then I did the thing I always did. I zipped the door fully closed from the inside, drew the slider to the very top, and tucked the pull tab under a fold of fabric so it could not drift back down on its own. I want you to remember that tuck. It mattered later. The rain reached a point where it stopped being weather and became environment, a permanent condition rather than an event. I read, I dozed, I listened, and I thought about something I usually kept underwater, that if anything went wrong out here, nobody would know for days. No one was expecting a call. No one counted the hours until I came home. That knowledge sat on my chest heavier than the gray light, and I told myself it was peace. I fell asleep around 9. The rain was my white noise, filling the tent with a hiss that drowned the smaller sounds of the forest and sealed me in a cocoon so complete it was almost womb-like. I slept without dreams. Just darkness and rain and the slow drift you get when the body is spent and the mind has nothing left to chew. I woke at dawn to gray half-light and a lighter, steadier drizzle ticking on the fly like a clock. I was on my back, warm, unwilling to face another wet day, and then the zipper moved. I heard it before I saw it, that dry metallic whisper of a slider drawn along its track, each coil clicking as it engaged and released. It was coming from the door I had sealed, but it was traveling the wrong way, down. From the top where I had tucked it, descending toward the bottom, slowly, one tooth at a time, with a deliberation that no wind and no gravity could fake. I turned my head. In the gray light, I could see the slider, a small dark shape against the pale fabric, and it was moving, a fraction of an inch. A pause. Another fraction. Through the widening gap, I could see the forest floor, the dark spruce trunks, the rain hitting the mud. No hand, no fingers on the pull tab, no shadow of anyone crouched at my door. I did not move. It was not courage, and it was not quite fear. It was the paralysis of a mind meeting something its whole framework refuses to hold. Zippers do not open themselves. They need force applied to a tab in a chosen direction. Wind cannot do it. Rain cannot do it. And gravity could not do it here because the slider was starting from the top, and something had to break the stillness to send it down 6 inches. 8. A foot. The gap widened, and the rain came through it in a fine cold mist that touched my face, and that coldness was the worst part, because it confirmed this was real. Then the smell arrived with the mist. Wet earth, which I expected. Cold air, which I expected. And underneath, something faintly sweet and faintly organic. The smell of flowers left too long in a vase, when the water has turned and the stems have gone soft. Not rot exactly, just something well past living. The zipper kept going. 18 inches. 2 feet. The door flap sagged away from the frame under the weight of collected rain, and now I could see a broad sweep of the campsite. The waterlogged meadow, the dripping spruce, the rain falling on all of it with the same indifferent constancy, and nothing else. No boots in the mud, no knees pressed to the ground, no silhouette against the tree line. Nothing that could account for the thing that was patiently unzipping the only wall between me and the outside. Here is what I keep circling back to. I had tucked that tab. I remember the small resistance of the fabric fold as I pressed it under. Whatever pulled it free had to find it first. When the slider reached the bottom of the track, the flap fell fully open, and my shelter became a three-walled thing exposed on its fourth side. Rain blew in across the vestibule and onto my sleeping bag, onto my face, and I lay there and looked out at the wilderness I thought I owned. I listened. The rain, the drip of the spruce, the far-off roar of the swollen creek, and under all of it, so quiet I might have invented it, breathing, not from outside, not from above or below or any direction I could point to. It came from the air itself, from the empty space where the door used to be, as if opening the tent had cut a channel through which something could exhale into my space. One long, sustained breath that carried the sweet wrong smell and the cold in a quality I have no better word for than attention. The unmistakable pressure of being watched by something that had chosen not to show itself. And I understood, lying in that soaked bag, that the wilderness I knew like my own house did not know me at all. All those trips, all that pride in my familiarity, I had mistaken being unnoticed for being welcome. I was not alone out here. I had simply never been interesting enough to open before. I got up, I put on my boots. I packed with hands that shook, not from the cold, but from a nervous system that had been screaming since the first click. Sleeping bag, pad, stove, food, everything crammed into the pack with the efficiency of pure urgency. I broke the tent down last, and when I pulled the nylon into its stuffed sack, the sweet smell was strongest right at the door, soaked into the fabric around the zipper track, as if whatever had drawn that slider had left something of itself behind on the teeth. I hiked out 9 miles in 4 hours through rain that had turned the trail into a river. The creek crossings ran waist deep. The rhododendron tunnels grabbed my pack and my arms and my legs, branch after branch closing on me, and I could not shake the feeling that the forest itself was trying to hold me in place a little longer. I did not stop, not until the trailhead, not until my truck, not until the gravel gave way to pavement, and pavement gave way to a motel room in Richwood with a deadbolt and a television and walls that did not breathe. I still have the tent. I have used it since, on nights when the sky is clear and the sight is shared, and the loneliness is thin enough that I feel the way I used to feel outdoors, before the cranberry taught me the difference between solitude and exposure. But the zipper has never worked right again. It catches at one specific point on the track, about 12 inches from the bottom. The slider resists and stutters and needs an extra push to move past, as if the teeth there were bent, or the track deformed, or as if something in the mechanism simply remembers. I have examined it under good light more times than I will admit. The teeth are aligned. The track is straight. The slider is clean. There is nothing wrong with it that any eye can find, but it stops at that exact point, every single time, 12 inches from the bottom. The precise width the door had reached the moment I understood. The breathing was not coming from any direction I could run. People tell me zippers wear out. They tell me it is the moisture, the age, the cold. They are probably right, but it does not just stick there. It stops the same way it stopped that morning, at the same width, as though the track recorded the one time it was used by hands that were not mine and preserved that moment in its motion. A permanent hesitation held open, not wide enough for me to leave, but wide enough for something else to enter. And there is one thing I have never told anyone, because the others said it was worn out, and I let them. The sweet smell never left the fabric. It faded over the years everywhere except that 12-inch stretch. When the slider catches, and I force it, and the teeth part at that exact point, I can still catch it for half a second. Flowers gone over in old water. The smell of something well past living, waiting in the seam. I go into the backcountry now the way I go into a house I have been warned about. I no longer tuck the tab under the fold. There is no point. I know the room by feel, and the room knows me back, and every time that zipper stops 12 inches from the bottom, I am reminded that something touched it in the rain, took its time, and left. The mechanism has never forgotten the shape of that morning. Neither have I. And some nights, lying warm and dry and listening to the rain become environment again, I wonder which of us it is really waiting for.
Julian!
Smoke woke me before midnight, fresh and green and wrong, because the fire in Uncle Ray's clearing had been dead for 3 hours. The worst part was not that it had relit itself in the rain, but that it smelled like someone had just arrived. I was 36. lying in a cheap tent on 60 acres of Raleigh County timber with my brother Kevin 25 feet away, and the woods outside had started behaving like we were not the only ones using them. Uncle Ray's land dropped from his ridge road toward the New River Gorge in a long, wooded slide of oak, poplar, and hemlock. He had owned it since the 70s, but below the first cleared 100 yards, he treated it like something that belonged to itself. Kevin and I had asked to camp there because we needed a brother's weekend, or at least that was the clean version. The truth was that Mom had died in June, and I had been avoiding Kevin because grief made him talk and made me disappear. Ray told us to follow the old hunting path until we saw a rusted survey stake with a strip of orange tape tied to it, then keep downhill until the ground leveled. He said there was a fire ring in a small clearing, built from creek stones so old they had sunk halfway into the dirt. He also said, "You'll know it when you get there," in the casual tone old mountain men use when they are not really being casual at all. I heard the warning and pretended it was directions. Kevin noticed the orange tape first, snapping wetly in the wind like a little warning flag. He was always better at finding things in the woods, even when we were kids, and I was better at acting like I was not scared. On the hike down, he kept counting steps under his breath, not loudly, just enough for me to hear the rhythm. He had counted when he was nervous since childhood, and I hated that I still found it comforting. The clearing looked ordinary in the weak October light. 40 feet across, ringed by dark trunks, with the stone fire pit in the middle and the slope dropping away beyond it toward the gorge. I put my tent on the downhill side, not because it was flatter, but because it gave me distance from Kevin's muttering when he slept. That was the kind of small selfishness grief sharpens until it looks practical. The rain came in pulses while we set up, hard enough to bead on our sleeves, soft enough to keep us believing the night would be fine. We gathered deadfall, built a sloppy fire, cooked sausages, and drank beer while the woods tightened around us. Kevin tried twice to talk about Moms last week, and twice I changed the subject to work, football, anything with corners. By 8, the fire was coughing steam and the rain had turned steady. Kevin poured half a bottle of water over the coals, even though the flames were already gone. "Habit," he said, and his smile looked tired in the gray. The ring gave off that drowned campfire smell, sour ash and wet charcoal, the smell of an ending that does not need help. We crawled into our tents, and I listened to rain ticking on nylon while Kevin shifted and murmured across the clearing. After a while, his counting blurred into the weather. Then the smoke came, not old smoke, not the dead, soaked stink we had gone to sleep with. This was sharp and hot, full of sap and split bark, the smell of green branches being forced to burn before they were ready. I opened my tent zipper 6 inches. An orange light poured through the gap like it had been waiting outside. The fire ring was burning full and high in the rain. Flames stood 2 feet tall, steady as gas jets, licking around a tight cone of dark branches I had not gathered and Kevin had not stacked. Rain fell straight through the light, visible as silver needles, and the fire ignored every drop. Across the clearing, Kevin's tent flap was open the same 6 inches as mine, and his face hovered in the slit, pale and wet-eyed. He was already watching. Neither of us spoke, because speaking would have made one of us responsible for naming it. The fire cracked and popped with the cheerful sound of dry wood, but everything around it was soaked black. Steam lifted from the ground near the ring, not from the flames, but from the rain-wet leaves warming under a heat that should not have existed. The smoke rose in a straight column and disappeared into the canopy without bending. I told myself someone had come into the clearing while we slept. A hunter, a trespasser, some drunk local who knew Ray's land and thought it would be funny to scare 2 grown men in nylon tents. But there were no footsteps in the mud, no flashlight beam fading into the trees, no sound of retreating brush. Just the fire and rain and Kevin breathing too fast across from me. Then Kevin started counting again. At first I thought he was doing it without realizing, the old anxiety habit leaking out. His lips moved in the orange light, and I could hear the numbers under the rain. 8, 9, 10. He stopped at 12, swallowed, and started over. 1, 2, 3. I whispered his name. He did not look at me. His eyes stayed fixed on the fire ring, and I realized he was not counting seconds or breaths or anything inside himself. He was counting something he could see. I followed his stare to the stones, around the top edge of the fire ring. Shapes had appeared where there had only been soot-dark creek rock before. Small flat stones, smooth and oval, balanced around the circle with unnatural care. The flames made them difficult to count because they flashed and vanished behind the burning branches. But Kevin had already done it. 12. The number landed in my head with a physical weight. 12 stones, 12 places, 12 marks around a fire that had not been built by us and would not die in the rain. I remembered Ray saying the ring was old, and I remembered the orange tape snapping on the rusted stake, and for the first time that day it did not feel like a trail marker. It felt like a boundary we had crossed because someone had made it easy. The fire did not grow or shrink. It held itself at the same height, same shape, same steady violence. My watch said 12:12, which seemed too neat, so I tapped the screen and blamed condensation. When I checked again 5 minutes later, it still said 12:12. The rain kept time instead, thousands of tiny impacts on leaves and nylon and skin. A voice came from the trees behind my tent. It was not loud. It was not even clearly a voice at first, more like wet bark rubbing against wet bark. Then it said my name in Kevin's voice, from the downhill dark where Kevin was not. My brother's face stayed framed in his tent across the clearing, mouth open, eyes shining, while the woods behind me breathed my name again. I should have run to him. That is what I tell myself when I replay it, because it sounds better than the truth. The truth is that I stayed half inside my tent, holding the zipper like a child holding a blanket, while my brother sat 25 feet away and shook so hard the nylon around him trembled. I had wanted distance from him, and the clearing had given it to me. Kevin finally looked at me. His expression was not fear anymore. It was recognition, and that was worse. "Do you hear, Mom?" he whispered. I shook my head before I listened, because I did not want to listen. But under the rain, behind the crackle, something soft moved through the woods in the cadence of our mother clearing her throat before calling us in for dinner. Kevin. Danielle. Two names drawn out with equal patience. The firelight pressed against the trees, but it did not enter them. Kevin started unzipping his tent. I said, "Do not." It came out too sharp, like a command I had no right to give. He paused with one hand on the flap, and for 1 second we were boys again, hiding in separate bedrooms while Mom cried in the kitchen after Dad left, waiting for one of us to go to her. Kevin always went first. I always let him. The flames went out, not down, not low. Out. The clearing dropped into black, so suddenly my eyes hurt, and the rain filled the empty space where the fire had been. Kevin made a small sound, not a scream, more like a breath being taken away from him. We stayed still for a long time. My watch finally changed to 12:13. That single minute felt like an accusation. When I clicked on my headlamp, the beam shook so badly it scattered across the trees, the tents, the ring. No smoke drifted from the pit. Kevin came out first. I followed because being alone in the tent had become worse than being in the open. We approached the ring together, shoulder to shoulder, our boots sinking into leaf rot. The ash inside the circle was black, flat, and rain-pocked, with no glow at all. I held my palm over it. Nothing. No heat, no warmth stored in the stones, no breath of a fire that had just burned hot enough to dry my face. The 12 small stones sat evenly around the rim, each one flat side up. On the downhill side of the ring, directly facing my tent, there was a narrow gap between two of them just wide enough for another stone. Kevin saw it too. His counting stopped. In that silence, the woods behind me whispered my name one last time, but this time it used my own voice. We packed in the dark without discussing it. Every zipper sounded obscene, every snapped buckle too loud, like we were interrupting something that had not finished. Kevin kept glancing at the fire ring, and I kept watching the gap on the downhill side, convinced a 13th stone would appear if I looked away. The orange tape on the survey stake was gone when we reached it, but the rusted metal was still there. Wet in the truck, Kevin asked if I had taken one. His voice was flat, not accusing, just emptied out. I said no, and he said he had not either, and we both knew the question had not come from nowhere. We drove to a diner in Beckley and sat under fluorescent lights while rainwater dried on our sleeves. At 3:17 in the morning, surrounded by truckers and coffee steam, the woods still felt closer than the parking lot. Kevin tried to make it smaller. Maybe the fire had not been fully out. Maybe the stones had been there, and we had missed them. Maybe grief makes patterns where there are only rocks and smoke. He said all of this while staring at his hands, and every explanation sounded like a door being locked from the wrong side. I did not tell him what I had heard in my own voice. He did not tell me what Mom had said from the trees. That was the last mercy we gave each other that night. By sunrise, we had agreed to tell Uncle Ray only the practical parts, the fire and the stones, nothing about voices. Men in my family have always mistaken silence for protection. Ray listened the following week at his kitchen table, his big hands folded around a mug he never drank from. When we finished, he stared out toward the tree line below his house. He did not look surprised. That frightened me more than anything he could have said. My grandmother Ora knew that place, he said finally. She called it a meeting ground. He told us the fire ring was older than his deed, older than the old logging roads, older than any family story he trusted. Ora said people had gathered there before there were roads on the ridge, before the gorge had viewing platforms and park signs and tourists. Only she never called them people after the first telling. Ray remembered that clearly because his mother corrected her once, and Ora had gone quiet for the rest of dinner. According to Ora, on certain wet nights, the fire would light itself. It meant a meeting was in session, whether the living could see the ones attending or not. If you found yourself nearby, you stayed still, you did not answer when called, and you left at first light. Then Ray looked at us the way a doctor looks before giving results and said, "And you do not touch the stones." Kevin said too quickly, "We did not." Ray nodded, but his eyes moved between us. "Good," he said. Then, after a long pause, "Did either of you speak to it?" Neither of us answered. That was answer enough. Ray rubbed his face with both hands and looked suddenly older than I had ever seen him. Ora had told him the stones were not decorations. They were seats or names or markers for those expected to attend. She never explained which, only that the number mattered and the spaces mattered more. A missing stone meant someone had been invited late. The downhill gap opened inside my memory like a wound. I saw my tent placed there by my own choice. My little selfish distance from Kevin turned into a position at the edge of the circle. I saw him counting because he had understood before I did that the arrangement was not complete. I saw the orange tape not as a marker Ray had tied, but as something bright enough to guide us to a place that wanted witnesses. Ray swore he had not put any tape on that stake in years. Kevin stopped sleeping after that. At least, he stopped admitting that he slept. His wife called me 2 weeks later and said he had started counting in the shower in the garage at red lights. Always to 12, then a pause, then one more number under his breath so softly she could not be sure she heard it. 13. I drove to his house that night and found him sitting on the back porch in the rain with no coat on. He looked embarrassed when he saw me, like I had caught him doing something private. On the table beside him was a smooth, flat stone, wet on top though the porch was covered. He said it had been in his boot since the campsite, wedged deep in the tread where neither of us had noticed. I wanted to throw it into the street. I wanted to drive it back to Ray's land and drop it on the ring and apologize to whatever listened from the trees. Instead, I stood there while Kevin cried without sound, and for the first time since Mom died, I put my hand on his shoulder and kept it there. His skin was cold through his shirt. We took the stone back at dawn. Ray would not come with us, but he gave us a canvas bag and told us not to carry it barehanded. The orange tape was back on the stake, clean and bright as a fresh cut. Neither Kevin nor I mentioned it. Some signs become worse when acknowledged. The clearing was waiting. I know how that sounds, but there is no other word for the pressure in the air. The way the rain softened when we stepped into the trees, the way birdsong stopped at the rim of that flat shelf. The fire ring sat in the center, black and ordinary. 12 stones circled the top, evenly spaced, with the downhill gap still open. Kevin placed the stone there with canvas between his fingers and the rock. It fit too well. The moment it touched the ring, my watch jumped to 12:12, though the morning sun was somewhere behind the clouds. From the gorge below, faint and far away, came the smell of fresh green wood beginning to burn. We did not stay. We did not run either. We walked uphill like men leaving a funeral they had not been invited to, and neither of us looked back when Mom called our names from the clearing. Kevin squeezed my arm once, hard enough to hurt, and I understood he had hurt her too. He has not counted since that morning. That should comfort me, but it does not. Last night, smoke woke me in my own bedroom, fresh and green and wrong, and when I opened my eyes, there was orange light breathing under the door. On the floor beside my bed sat a smooth, flat stone, dry as bone, waiting for my hand. If you ever wake up in a spruce stand during a November rain and hear two men talking uphill from your tent, do not answer them. I answered 7 times. Each time I answered, they moved closer, and by the last time, one of them had started to sound like my father, who had been dead for 8 months and never set foot in that part of West Virginia in his life. I have a degree in environmental science. I know exactly how insane that sentence is, and I am going to say it anyway. Here is what you should know about me first, because it matters. I studied at WVU. I've spent hundreds of nights in backcountry across 3 states, and I understand acoustics better than most people who bring it up when I tell this story. Temperature inversions channel sound along valleys. Rain amplifies and redirects it across distances that feel impossible. White noise makes the brain build patterns out of nothing, the same way it finds faces in wallpaper. I know all of that, and none of it covers what happened east of Seneca Rocks in November of 2022. I went in alone on a Friday into the drainage between North Fork Mountain and a run of unnamed ridges, because alone was the only setting I had left. My father had died in March. Since the funeral, I'd been driving 3 hours every other weekend to places where nobody could ask me how I was holding up. The rain had been going for 3 days, that gray Appalachian drizzle, without enough conviction to be a storm or enough decency to quit, and the hollows had filled with fog like water filling a bowl. I left the trail after a mile and started bushwhacking uphill through wet hardwood. The mud on that slope took prints like fresh concrete. I remember looking back at my own tracks and noticing, the way you notice a familiar flaw, that my left boot heel was chipped, a chunk gone out of the outer edge from a rock scramble in the Roan Highlands, leaving a little crescent of missing tread in every print. One clean set of boot marks going up. Mine. I remember thinking that if anything happened to me, that was the trail they'd follow. The transition into red spruce was abrupt, the way it always is at elevation. Within 100 yards, the light dropped, the wind died, and the canopy closed overhead like a lid being set on a pot. Rain stopped falling on me and started arriving as a fine, constant mist that got through everything, regardless of what the tag on your jacket promised. And the sound changed. In the hardwood, it had been a patter, individual drops on individual leaves. In the spruce, it became a hiss, one continuous, undifferentiated hiss from every direction at once, the loudest quiet I have ever stood inside, like the forest exhaling and never needing to take another breath. I found the bench around 3, exactly where the topo said it would be. 20 feet of flat ground carpeted in needles, sheltered on 3 sides, open on the 4th to a slope dropping away into the hollow. I pitched the tent and cooked dinner, and I narrated the whole thing out loud, because that's a habit I picked up after March. Stakes in, pot on, water's going, talking to nobody, so the silence wouldn't get the last word. At 5, it was already full dark under that canopy. I got in my bag with a book and my headlamp, and before I turned the light off, I did the other thing I'd been doing since March. I played the voicemail. 41 seconds, saved from the previous October. My dad's voice telling me about a hemlock that came down across his driveway and how the guy who cut it up knew his grandmother, and then trailing off into a story he never got to finish because the message cut him off. I'd let that call go to voicemail on purpose. I was busy. I never called back, and then he was gone, and 41 seconds is what I have. I fell asleep to the hiss around 9. I surfaced at 11:07 and did not go back under, because woven into the white noise, threaded through it like a wire and cloth, there were 2 men having a conversation, 2 voices, both male, close in register but distinguishable, one slightly faster and higher than the other. They were uphill, faint right at the edge of the rain noise, and they had the easy back and forth rhythm of people who've been talking so long they don't have to think about whose turn it is. My first thought was hikers. I held that thought for maybe 2 minutes, and then it fell apart in my hands. Nobody bushwhacks 2 miles into roadless terrain in a November rainstorm to camp, and those voices weren't muffled by nylon. They were open-air voices. Two people standing outside in the rain, unhurried, at ease. I called out, "Hey, hello up there." My voice came out flat and small, swallowed by the needles before it got 20 feet. The voices stopped instantly, the exact pause of two men who heard something and turned their heads. I counted 10 seconds, 20. Then they started again, and they were closer. Not dramatically, maybe 50 feet nearer. Same calm cadence, same measured exchange, like the interruption had been noted and dismissed. I clicked my headlamp on and put the beam uphill and got silver rain lines, black spruce trunks, and a wall of white glow where the moisture diffused the light at about 100 feet. Nothing between the trees. The voices never flinched at the light. They kept talking straight through it, as if a beam of light were a thing that didn't apply to them. I called out again louder. Pause. Resume. 30 feet. That's close enough to see a jacket. Close enough to catch the wet shine of a face, the reflection off a retina, the movement of somebody shifting their weight on a slope. I swept the beam left to right across every foot of that distance, and there was nothing standing there, and the conversation continued from exactly where nothing was standing. For 3 hours, they circled me. That's the only word. The voices traveled the perimeter of my camp, uphill, then downslope, then around to my left, holding somewhere between 30 and 50 feet, never closing, never leaving. I banged my cook pot with a spoon until my ears rang. No reaction. I shouted until my throat hurt. Each time, that polite little pause, and then the conversation picked up again from a new bearing, and I understood something ugly. They weren't stopping because I'd startled them. They were stopping the way you stop when a dog barks in the next yard. Acknowledged. Irrelevant. Somewhere in the second hour, I quit trying to make it stop and started trying to take data, because that's the only way my brain knows how to survive anything. The conversation had structure. Long passages from one voice, short responses from the other, then a clean reversal. The second one talking at length while the first offered brief interjections at the joints. It was storytelling. One narrating, one bearing witness. The oldest arrangement two people can have, and the one I'd thrown away for 41 seconds of voicemail, but the language was wrong. Not foreign, wrong. I've heard Spanish, French, German, Mandarin, Arabic, and I can tell them apart without understanding a word. This matched nothing. Consonants formed deeper in the throat than modern speech requires. Vowels held too long, stretched until they went almost musical. The rhythm sat on rules that felt older than the rules I knew. Then I noticed the interjections. The listener's little sounds, the ones that mean go on, I'm still here. A short low hum, twice, with a beat of space between them. That is exactly the sound I make. My father used to imitate it. It's mine, it's a nothing, it's a tick, and it was out there in the dark at 30 feet, being used correctly. I got my phone out and recorded 11 minutes of it, because evidence is the only religion I have. Then I did the stupidest thing I have ever done in the woods. I played my father's voicemail out loud into the tent, full volume, 41 seconds. His voice about a hemlock in a driveway and a man who knew his grandmother. The forest went quiet, not the rain. The rain kept hissing. But the conversation outside stopped dead for the entire length of that message, and I lay there in the dark understanding, with total physical certainty, that I was being listened to for the first time all night. The voicemail ended on that unfinished sentence. 3 seconds of nothing. Then the talking resumed, and the slower voice had changed. The pacing, the little downhill drift at the end of a clause, the way it laid a beat of silence before a punchline. It had taken his rhythm. It was telling my father's story back into the trees in a language I will never learn. They faded at dawn the way a station fades when you drive out of range. Quieter, farther, blending into the hiss until there was no line between them and the rain. Morning came gray and cold and completely empty. I packed in about 9 minutes. Here's what I found on that bench before I left. No footprints. Not one. Anywhere in the soft needle duff except my own around the tent. But there was a path. A shallow, pressed-down trough running a rough circle through the litter at about 35 feet out, all the way around my camp, the needles compacted like something heavy had gone over them many, many times. Not that night. Over years. I have never had an explanation for that, and I have stopped looking for one. The other thing I found was on the way down. My tracks from Friday were still there in that concrete mud, crisp, the little crescent gap at the left heel in every print, and beside them, heading downhill, going out, the same tread, the same missing crescent, filled with rainwater that had had all night to settle. Tracks of me leaving made hours before I left. I took the recording to a linguistics professor at WVU. She heard rain and gave me the word pareidolia, kindly. A folklorist told me the Shawnee and the Delaware had stories about voices in the high unbroken spruce, and that those stories are older than the names on our maps. The old ranger at the Seneca Rocks Visitor Center listened to the whole thing without blinking and said, "There are things in these mountains that talk to each other." He said it the way you'd say the creek is up. Then he asked me one question. "Did you answer them?" I said yes. He asked how many times, and when I told him 7, he looked at the floor for a while and said I should have stopped at 1, because that's the part I finally understand. I wasn't afraid out there, not the whole time. Some of it was worse than fear. I lay in that tent listening to 2 beings tell each other stories with the patience of things that have all the time in the world, and what I felt was envy, the specific, humiliating envy of a man who'd been given a story once and let it go to voicemail. They didn't want me. They didn't need me. They were a conversation that had been going long before I got there and kept going after I left, and I was a dog barking in the next yard. I still go back to the Monongahela. I still sleep in spruce, not on that ridge. And this is the part I don't tell the people who ask. 6 weeks after I got home, I played the voicemail in my apartment in Morgantown, and in the pauses between my father's sentences, the little gaps where he stopped to breathe, something answered him. Low, throat deep, vowels held too long. It answers in every gap now. 41 seconds, 4 gaps, 4 responses. I've played it enough to have them memorized, and I can't stop playing it because it's the only conversation my father is still having, and I refuse to be the one who hangs up. So here's the warning I actually owe you. If you're ever in the spruce in November and the hiss drops just low enough for the words to come through, don't answer, don't record it, and don't offer it anything of yours to carry. I don't listen for them anymore. In the apartment, when rain runs down the gutter outside my window and the sound goes flat and continuous, 2 voices start up in the next room, patient and unhurried, one telling and one bearing witness. I answer them every single time, and every time they come a little closer, and one of them sounds a little more like me. I fell asleep zipped inside a 1-person tent, and I woke up 7 hours later 30 feet away, flat on my back in the mud, with my boots laced onto my feet. The mud between me and that tent was smooth as poured batter. No footprints, not mine, not anybody's, and I have spent 2 years trying to find a version of that sentence that lets me sleep. My name doesn't matter much, but the details do, because the details are all I have. I survey land for a living out of Elkins, West Virginia, which means I measure things for a living, and I am very hard to convince that a measurement is wrong. October 14th, 2023, Otter Creek Wilderness. I do not drink in the backcountry. I do not take anything, prescribed or otherwise, because impairment in the woods is how they find you in the spring by the smell. I hike alone because being alone is the only place I stop performing. My ex-wife, Dana, used to say I had a talent for turning help into an insult. The last real thing she ever said to me, standing in a kitchen with her keys already in her hand, was that I would rather freeze to death than let anybody carry me. I laughed at that. I want you to remember that I laughed. The rain started on the drive down and settled in like it had signed a lease. By the time I'd gone 3 miles up the trail, the creek was loud in a way that changes your plans for you. The crossings that should have been shin-deep pushing knee-high and shoving at my poles. I decided to cut the trip short, sleep one night, hike out at dawn. 50 yards off the trail and up a rise, I found a thicket of rhododendron so dense it made its own weather. If you have never walked through Otter Creek rhododendron, understand that it does not grow like a shrub. It grows like architecture. The branches arch and interlock overhead and form these low black tunnels through the understory, and inside them it is dim at noon and absolute at night. I found a flat opening in the middle of it, maybe 8 feet across, where the canopy was thick enough to hold most of the rain off the ground. The soil was soft. That should have bothered me more than it did. I set up the way I always set up, in the same order, because order is the thing I have instead of company. Tent staked, rainfly drum tight, boots off and placed in the vestibule side by side, laces loosened all the way so I could jam my feet in fast if something went wrong in the night, headlamp into the mesh pocket by my head, where my right hand lands automatically without thinking. Then the door, zipped from the inside, slider dragged from the bottom of the track to the top and seated at the apex, and then checked once more with 2 fingers. The way my father taught me to check everything twice. My father also taught me to tie a double knot, over and then under, twisting to the left every time. The same knot on boots and on tarps and on the last thing he ever tied, which was a rope on a boat trailer 3 days before he died. I have never tied it any other way. My hands do not know how. That is not sentiment, it is mechanics. I got into my bag and zipped it to my chin. The rain on the fly was that steady percussion that tells the animal part of your brain the night is handled. You can stand down. I went under fast, the way a stone goes under, straight down without any of the drifting. No dreams. I remember closing my eyes at 9, and I remember opening them at 4. Rain was falling directly onto my face, not filtered through nylon, onto my open eyes, running into my ears, and the cold of it came a half second after the wet, which is how I knew I was actually awake. My hair was flattened to my skull. Under my back and legs was mud, soft and yielding and smelling like a turned garden, and I was still inside my sleeping bag, zipped to the chin, the pole tucked exactly where I'd left it, and my boots were on my feet, inside the bag, laced and double knotted snug the way I'd tie them for a full day of climbing. That bag zips from the bottom with the opening at my chest. There is no arrangement of my spine that puts boots on my feet inside a closed sleeping bag, and I lay there in the mud, doing the geometry over and over, like a man checking a bill he cannot afford. I reached for my headlamp out of reflex, right hand going to a mesh pocket that was 30 feet away, and my knuckles hit it on the first try. It was clipped to the chest strap of my sleeping bag, not dropped there. Clipped, with the band folded once and the lamp facing out, positioned exactly where a hand searching in the dark would find it without searching. Somebody had thought about my hand. The beam gave me a wall. Rhododendron, dripping, packed shoulder to shoulder, curving away in both directions and closing over the top into a dome. I was lying in the center of a circular clearing maybe 10 feet across. Bare dirt, no leaf litter, no fallen branch, no stone. Directly above me the dome had a single gap, and the rain was coming through it in a narrow column that fell precisely onto the spot where my body had been. I had been placed under a faucet. The mud held one impression, and it was mine. Shoulders, hips, heels, already filling with water. Everywhere else that ground was smooth and unmarked. No boot prints, no bare feet, no drag furrow, no knee dents, nothing that had crossed it. Wet earth records everything. That is the entire reason I trust it professionally. That night it recorded exactly one event, and the event was me arriving without traveling. My tent glowed orange through a gap in the branches, 30 feet out. I peeled the soaked bag off my legs like a skin and crossed to it, and I stopped a yard short. The rainfly was taut. The stakes were seated. The door was zipped shut, slider parked at the top of the track, in the closed position, which is where it goes when a person standing outside pulls it up behind them. You cannot zip a tent shut from the outside while you're in it. I want to be exact, because exactness is the only dignity I had left out there. The slider must be on the outer track, and it must be pulled by a hand in the rain. Somebody had stood where I was standing, in the dark, 3 feet from my sleeping face, and closed the door after taking me out of it. Inside, nothing was wrong, and that was worse. My pad was still inflated and lying square. The stuff sack sat in the corner. My pack was in the vestibule, rain cover on. The only things that had left that tent were me, my bag, and my boots, which had gone from beside the door to onto my feet, and the mesh pocket by my head was hanging open and empty. I broke camp in the dark with hands that would not hold a stake straight, and I hiked out. 3 miles, 4 in the morning, headlamp on the trail, and nothing but the trail. Somewhere in the first quarter mile the feeling started, and it was not the feeling of being followed. Being followed sits between your shoulder blades. This sat on the crown of my head, a steady downward attention, the sense that the canopy was not vegetation but an audience, and that something up in it was matching my pace without moving a single leaf. I did not look up. Not once, not at the crossings. Not when the rhododendron closed over the trail into those black tunnels and the rain came through in aimed little streams. I understood, in a place below language, that looking up would resolve something, and that I would then have to carry the resolution for the rest of my life. So I watched the mud, and I walked fast, and I let it watch the top of my head for 3 miles. I reached the truck at 5:30. Empty lot. I sat with the heater roaring and the wipers going, and the tree line standing there black and dripping and patient, and I drove home to Elkins and stood in the shower for 45 minutes without getting warm. Afterward, I sat on the edge of the bed in a towel and looked at my boots on the bathroom tile. The soles and the welts were packed with fresh mud from the hike out, gray and gritty, but the uppers, the leather that had been sealed inside a zipped sleeping bag, were clean. Not rinsed clean. Never touched clean, with the dust of my truck bed still in the seams, which means they were not put on my feet in that clearing. They were put on my feet while I was dry, while I was warm, while I was inside my tent, while I was asleep. Something knelt in the doorway of a tent I had zipped and checked twice, and it dressed me for the weather before it carried me out. The sleep study came back clean. No parasomnia, no REM behavior disorder, none of the electrical signatures that come with sleepwalking. The neurologist looked at his own printout for a while and said, "You did not walk there." I said, "I know." Neither of us said the next part, and I have always respected him for that. Here is what I have instead of an explanation. It never hurt me. It never even chilled me, because it dressed me first. It laced my boots. It clipped my headlamp where my hand would land. It carried me 30 feet through the air without pressing one footprint into ground that would have taken the print of a mouse. And it set me down so gently that the mud only holds one shallow shape. It put me under the one hole in the canopy, in a room with round walls, the way you would set something in the middle of a table. Then it went back and closed the door of a shelter I would not be needing. That is the part that eats me, not violence. Care. I built a whole life around never being lifted, never being tended to, never letting a single person do for me what I could do for myself. And Dana walked out of a kitchen telling me I would rather freeze than be carried. Something in those woods heard that as a request. 2 weeks later, I untied those boots to clean them properly, and my hands stopped. The knots were mirrored. Over, under, twisting to the right, everyone. My father's knot run backward, the way it would come out if a person were kneeling in front of me, facing me, working in the dark by feel, doing it the way you do it for a child who cannot do it himself yet. So I have rules now. I do not camp in rhododendron. I do not go near Otter Creek. I zip from the inside and check twice, and I leave my boots outside the vestibule entirely, out in the weather, because I would rather put on wet, cold leather than wake up already dressed. I keep the headlamp in my fist, and in the last thin minutes before sleep, I do not listen for footsteps outside the tent. I listen for the inside, for the fabric taking weight it should not be taking, for the small tug at my ankles of somebody being helpful. 6 weeks ago, I camped on a ridge above Glady, no rhododendron for a mile, boots left out in the frost where I could see them through the mesh. I fell asleep zipped inside my tent, and I woke up 7 hours later inside my tent, warm, dry, in a bag I did not remember re-zipping. The boots were in the vestibule, side by side, and the soles were packed with wet black mud, and there is no wet black mud on that ridge in December. The laces were pulled snug, over, under, twisting right. The door was zipped shut from the outside. I don't know where I went that night. I don't know how many times it has already taken me and put me back tidy. My hair dried, my hand set near the light so I wouldn't be frightened when I woke. I have stopped asking whether it will happen again and started asking whether the round clearing is the destination or only the doorstep, and whether something has been kneeling over me since long before Otter Creek, patient in the dark above the trees, dressing me for a trip I keep agreeing to by falling asleep. I laughed when Dana said I would rather freeze than let anyone carry me. Something out there took it as a promise, and it is keeping it for both of us. He held the knife out toward me, palm up, like he wanted me to take it and go inside the cabin myself. It didn't make sense, and that was the part my brain got stuck on. I'd been solo camping an hour north of Fairbanks in the White Mountains for 2 days without seeing a single person. And in the last 6 hours, this same man had found me twice without making a sound. I came out here because I was tired of being needed, which is a terrible reason to drive into nowhere, Alaska with a tent. My sister had just had her second kid, and my mom kept calling me to come home to Ohio, and I told everyone I needed to clear my head. Truthfully, I just wanted 3 days where no one asked me for anything, where if I said no, there was no one to hear it. I pitched my tent just off the main loop, built a proper fire ring stone by stone in a tight little circle, and told myself I was good at being alone. On that first afternoon, I noticed a thin cut in the spruce behind my site. Not a real trail, just a place where the branches didn't grow back. It dropped down through moss and roots and vanished into thicker trees. I figured it went to one of those public use shelters they scatter around up here. The little plywood cabins you can crash in first come, first serve. I marked it in my head and otherwise forgot about it because I had food and a tent and I did not need a cabin. Just past noon on day 2, I was stirring instant chili over my fire when he stepped into my camp. No snap of twig, no rustle. Just suddenly a man in a green rain shell with a backpack that looked completely flat, like it was empty. He smiled and asked if I knew where the cabin was, like we were neighbors. I told him about that thin cut behind my site, said it probably went there, and he thanked me and walked away toward the tree line. I watched him go until the spruce swallowed him, and I realized I had not seen where he came from, trail or bush. I told myself that was normal. People get turned around. Alaska makes everyone look a little ghostly. I tended the fire, read, napped, ate, and let the afternoon stretch like it does up there where the sun never really drops. Around 9 or 10, the light went amber and low, and the forest threw long shadows that made everything look like it was leaning in. That is, when I saw him again, coming out of those shadows, same green shell, same flat pack, he said he could not find the shelter. I said maybe there was not one. Maybe I had been wrong about the path, and he corrected himself quick, said no, he never found the path I had mentioned. That snagged wrong because that path was impossible to miss if you were looking, and he had been gone for almost 9 hours. He asked me to show him, and I started doing the thing I came out here to stop doing, which was explaining why I could not. He said he did not have a tent and was counting on that cabin, and his voice went flat and tired in a way that made me feel cruel for hesitating. I told myself it was a 10-minute walk, that I would point to the opening and come right back, that being helpful was not being weak. I threw my bag over my shoulder by habit, because out here you do not leave your things, and led him to that cut in the trees. He did not talk on the way, and with every step the forest got quieter in a way that did not feel natural. The moss swallowed our boots until there were no footfalls at all, mine or his. Then the trees broke just enough, and I saw it through the trunks, that little cabin at the end of the path, closer than it should have been. You could see it too clearly, broken windows, black mold up the doorframe, a roof sagging like a tired back, the kind of place they stopped maintaining for a reason. I turned to say, well, there it is, and the words dried out in my mouth. He had stopped 10 feet back. His arm was out, hand open, a short hunting knife laid across his palm like an offering. He stared right through me and said, "Go in a voice with no air behind it. My first thought was not to scream. It was that I was still being polite, still trying to figure out what he meant so I would not embarrass him. I asked what he was doing, and he did not answer. He just repeated it. Go in, same flat tone, same dead stare. My hands went hot and then completely cold. I understood in that second that going into that cabin was the worst possible choice I could make. There was still distance between us, maybe 15 feet of soft ground. I shrugged and dropped my pack to move faster, keys, phone, wallet, everything thumping down in that moss, and I ran. I did not run on the path. I cut straight into black spruce, branches slapping my face, lungs burning from cold air. He did not chase me. That was worse than if he had. I stopped after maybe 100 yards, gasping, looking back, and he was still standing exactly where I had left him, arm out, knife lit by that amber sun that never sets. He was not watching me anymore. He was looking at the cabin door. I crouched behind a deadfall and stayed there, 30 minutes by my watch that felt like 3 hours, listening to my own heart. The forest in late summer up there never gets dark, just this deep blue dusk, and every spruce started to look like a man standing still. I kept telling myself I was safe because I could see, but the light was a trick. It flattened everything so you could not tell how far anything was. I kept telling myself I was smart for dropping the bag, then the shame hit, sharp and stupid. My bag had everything: my car keys 2 miles away at the pullout, my satellite messenger, my knife. I had made myself helpless because I had panicked, because I had reverted to being a kid who drops his books to run faster. I had to go back, not to the campsite, to that thin path where I had left it. I moved quiet, coming in wide so I was not on the path at all. The cabin looked empty, door half open, black inside even with the sky still bright. He was not standing there anymore, and neither was my bag. The moss where I had dropped it was pressed down exactly in the shape of it, but empty. That imprint messed with me more than if there had been nothing. It meant he had picked it up carefully, not snatched it, and I started to understand this was not random. He wanted me to run. He wanted me without my things. I did not have a plan except getting back to the main trail and following it out, even if it took all night. I cut back toward my camp, staying low, and when I got close enough to smell wood smoke, my stomach dropped. My fire should have been dead, cold ash. Instead, it was burning high and fresh, the flame climbing as if someone had just fed it. I crept to the edge of the spruce and saw my tent still standing, the fire ring exactly where I had built it, except the stones were wrong. I had set them in a tight circle, one by one, wedged tight so they would hold heat. I remembered the feel of each one. Now they were spaced apart, sloppy, like someone who had never built one was guessing at the shape. And in the middle of that wrong circle sat my bag, upright, zippers closed, clean. I knew it was a lure and I almost walked into it anyway, because that is who I am, someone who will apologize to get his own wallet back. I took one step out, and then he walked out of the woods behind the fire. He did not look surprised. He tossed 2 more sticks on and sat cross-legged right beside my things, humming tunelessly under his breath like he was waiting for dinner. My mouth went dry because I recognized the tune, and it was nothing, just the little hum I had been doing while cooking chili earlier. That is when I stopped thinking he wanted to hurt me in the normal way. He had my fire, my bag, my whole camp arranged like he was keeping house, and he was humming my song because he had been listening since I got there. He had been there the whole 2 days, watching from that thin cut behind my sight that I thought I had discovered. I turned and left the light of my own fire and found the main trail by feel. I walked 2 miles in that never dark that makes you feel like you are walking in place. Every time I passed a gap in the trees, I thought I saw green, that flat pack, not behind me but ahead, like the trail looped. It took hours to reach the pullout and another hour to get a truck to stop because I had no keys, no phone, no proof I was not just some strung-out hiker. The driver did not ask many questions, which at the time felt like kindness. State troopers went out with 2 rangers the next morning while I sat in a Fairbanks motel that smelled like pine sol, trying not to shake. They called me that afternoon and said there was nothing there. No tent, no ash, no flattened moss where I had slept for 2 nights, and the firestones had been tossed out into the brush like someone had erased a circle. My bag, my tent, my stove, gone as if I had never come. One ranger stayed on the line longer and told me that shelter had been discontinued 6 years ago after the roof caved in, and they pulled it off maps and stopped cutting the spur trail. There should not have been a visible path to it at all anymore, especially not a clean, thin cut right behind a campsite. I asked where the real spur had been, and he said on the other side of the loop, half a mile south, completely overgrown. So what I found was not a trail to the cabin. The cabin was at the end of whatever that cut was. I kept thinking about his backpack while the ranger talked, how flat it had looked. Not empty flat, I realized now, but collapsed, like a bag that had been emptied a long time ago and just kept being carried. Like he did not need anything in it anymore, because he lived where he needed to be. He was not a camper looking for shelter. He was shelter looking for a camper. He held that knife out palm up like an offering because he was not going to use it on me. He wanted me to take it, to go into that cabin and take his place, so he could pick up my bag and my fire and be the one who got to leave. That is why he did not chase me, why he brought my things back like a host, why he built the fire wrong, because he had forgotten how. He learned to be quiet out there because the woods do not tolerate noise unless it is theirs. I still do not know how he moved without sound, even over dry spruce needles, Sometimes I wake up thinking I hear that tuneless hum right outside my apartment door, and then I realize it is my own throat doing it. I check my locks and I stack things in small circles without meaning to: coasters, mugs, shoes by the door. And I think about that imprint in the moss where my bag had been, neat and careful like a placeholder. I have not camped since. But last week, my sister sent me a picture from a trail outside town. Just trees, just a family hike. But in the background, there was a thin cut between two birches where the branches did not grow back. I stared at it until it looked like a doorway, until I could almost see a small cabin at the end of it that should not be there. I caught myself holding my kitchen knife palm up toward that picture on my phone without knowing when I had picked it up, offering it to no one and wanting someone to take it and go inside. Ethan's satellite message said he could see me, but I was half a mile away, alone between black spruce trees, with the sun sliding out of the main sky. The second I read it, the woods around me seemed to hold its breath, as if every trunk had turned its face. We had only been out there one night, just me and my childhood friend Ethan on a short backpacking trip to a clearing I knew better than my own driveway. By midnight, I would understand that something had been luring us from the dark. Ethan and I had camped together since we were kids, but adulthood had thinned us into occasional texts and birthdays we nearly missed. I suggested this trip because I wanted one weekend where he still trusted me to know the way. That was my pride. I knew this stretch of Maine woods, the hidden water, the unmarked turns, the clearing tucked several hours from the trailhead. Ethan had never been to this spot, and I liked that more than I admitted. Before we left the marked trail, I checked the faint blue surveyor's tape I had tied years earlier between the campsite and a private pond. I tied the same flat knot on every strip, low on the left side of the trees, so I could find the water without thinking. Our orange satellite messengers were clipped to our waist packs. Each one logged coordinates after a send, and a tiny gray eye appeared beside any message once it had been opened. On the hike in, Ethan laughed about how, when we were little, he never yelled "found you" during hide and seek. He would lean close and whisper, "I see you." We reached the clearing around 6, raised the tents, cooked over a clean little fire, and drank 2 warm beers while the light drained blue through the branches. For a while, it was exactly what I had wanted. Smoke in our clothes, lake-cold air, Ethan talking like the years had not taken anything. Then something moved just beyond the firelight. Not crashed or scampered, shifted, slow and careful, like a person adjusting their weight to keep a twig from snapping. We stared into the dark until our eyes watered, saw nothing, and decided it was an animal because that answer let us sleep. Morning made the night feel stupid. We followed my blue markers to the pond, a glassy bowl hidden off the real trail, fed by a narrow waterfall that stitched white noise through the trees. No one ever went there. That was the charm, and I had repeated it to Ethan like a promise. We swam, sat on warm rock, and watched dragonflies skim the surface until the hours slipped away too easily. Back at camp, near 6 again, I realized we had burned through most of the dry wood. I started gathering sticks while Ethan wandered off to explore, something he always did when he needed silence more than conversation. I said "sure" without looking up, and that single careless word has followed me longer than any scream could have. The sun kept lowering, the clearing cooled, and Ethan did not come back. When I pulled out my messenger, his name was already on the screen. Got turned around, at pond. I told him to stay there and started fast through the trees, following memory more than the blue tape. 4 or 5 minutes from the pond, the device chirped again. Ethan's new message contained only 3 words. "I see you." I stopped on a patch of damp needles with no water in sight, no Ethan in sight, and our old childhood phrase glowing in my hand like it had been waiting years to be used correctly. I sent back, "I am not there yet. Do not move." The tiny gray eye stayed absent beside my reply, meaning Ethan had not opened it, even though he had supposedly just seen me. Between the spruces, the dim trail seemed to narrow, and the blue tape I trusted looked paler than it had that morning. I began to run, not because I believed in anything impossible, but because I suddenly believed in being too late. The pond was empty in the way a house is empty when someone has just stepped into another room. Water folded over the little falls, hissing hard enough to hide footsteps. I called Ethan's name until my throat scraped, and every answer was only water and trees. On a maple near the shore, a strip of blue tape twitched in the wind, tied high on the right side of the trunk. I had never marked the pond itself. For a few seconds, I tried to make the world normal by force. Maybe Ethan had found the route back, or maybe he had panicked and gone the wrong way. Maybe the message had meant he saw my headlamp beam, except my headlamp was still buried in my pack. The sky was almost gone, and I had not lit the campfire before leaving. If I lost the clearing too, I would become one more moving sound outside someone else's fire. The walk back did not feel like half a mile. My watch insisted only 6 minutes passed, but the forest had rearranged its temperature, turning damp and cold enough to make my teeth touch. The blue strips appeared too often, then not at all. When the orange glow of our campsite finally pulsed between the trunks, relief hit me so hard I nearly laughed. Someone was standing beside the fire I had never lit. At first, I let myself think it was Ethan. The figure had the right height, the right slouch, the right stillness of someone tired from walking. Then it turned its head toward me, and the motion was wrong, too smooth at the neck, like a mask swiveling before the body remembered to follow. It ran. Not deer fast, not panic, just cleanly and silently into the black trees, leaving the campfire popping behind it. I came into camp with bear spray in one hand and my messenger in the other. The fire had been built the way I build fires, teepee first, birch bark tucked underneath, a little tunnel for air. My tent flap hung open, and the pile of wood I had gathered was sorted into careful lengths. Then Ethan burst from the opposite side of the clearing, stumbling so hard he hit his knees in the dirt. His face had the wet shine of someone who had been breathing through panic for a long time. He grabbed my arm and said we had to leave immediately. When I told him about the figure at our fire, his grip tightened until my wrist bones rubbed. At the pond, he had seen someone approaching through the trees and thought it was me, which was why he started toward him. But as the man came closer, Ethan saw a smile spreading across a face that did not seem attached to a thought. He said the eyes were patient, almost bored, like whatever looked out through them had practiced people from a distance. I asked why he texted, "I see you." Ethan shook his head before I finished. He had sent only the first message, the one saying he was lost at the pond. His screen showed nothing after that. On my device, the 3 words still sat under his name. While we stared at them, the tiny gray eye appeared beside my reply, and Ethan's messenger was dark and locked in his trembling hand. We packed without speaking in complete sentences. Tent poles snapped against our hands, the fire smoked sour, and the dark beyond the clearing made small patient sounds that stopped whenever we stopped. I kept seeing blue tape where no blue tape should have been, pale tabs fluttering deeper in the woods instead of toward the trail. Ethan refused to walk ahead of me, but he also kept flinching when I fell behind him. By the time we found the marked trail, neither of us trusted our own footsteps. The hike back to the car should have taken several hours, and maybe it did. Time came apart in pieces. 20 minutes of gravel under our boots, then the same fallen birch 3 times, then the smell of our campfire drifting ahead of us where no fire could be. Once, Ethan clamped a hand over my mouth because he heard me calling his name from behind us. I heard it too. It had my tired voice, my little upward break on the second syllable, and it sounded annoyed that he would not answer. We reached the car just before dawn and drove until the gaslight came on. Neither of us talked about police. All we had was a man, a duplicate message, a smile, and a fire built by hands that knew mine. At home, when the messengers finally synced, the ordinary details became coordinates for something impossible. Ethan's real message came from the pond, but the message that said "I see you" appeared only in my log, with its sender location stamped inside our campsite, 6 feet from the fire ring. My reply was opened at 2:17 that morning, long after both devices were in my kitchen. The blue tape was worse in photographs. In the pictures from our walk to the pond, some strips were tied high on the right side, not low on the left, and the knots were mine. In one photo, a bright new piece hung from a sapling behind Ethan's shoulder, pointing away from the water into a section of woods I had never entered. I zoomed until the pixels broke apart, trying to prove it was a leaf. It remained tape. The private phrase is what I cannot put down. That first night, by the fire, Ethan and I had laughed about childhood hide-and-seek, about him leaning close and whispering, "I see you," from under porches and behind snowbanks. 10 minutes later, something shifted outside the light, and we called it an animal, because an animal could not be listening. Maybe it learned the words then. Maybe it had known them long before Maine, and the trip only gave it enough dark to say them back. I had wanted Ethan to see me the way he used to. Certain, useful, the one who knew the way back. Instead, I led him to a place where being seen meant being selected. Afterward, he stopped camping, then stopped answering my calls unless his wife was in the room with him. When we do speak, he watches my mouth more than my eyes, like he is waiting for the smile to start in the wrong place. I cannot blame him. Last week, the old messenger chirped from the desk drawer where I keep it with the charging cable removed. Ethan answered my call in a whisper before I said hello, and he told me not to open it. But I had not touched the device. Its screen had already lit the crack under the drawer with his name and the words, "I see you." Then the tiny gray eye appeared beside the message by itself. The first message said Ethan could see me when I was half a mile away. This one lists the sender as 18 feet behind me, and the hallway at my back smells like wet pine smoke. The waltz did not drift through the trees. It erupted from the dark like a wound opening, a sudden violin screech that severed the twilight silence and left my ears ringing. I stood by my campfire, a handful of trail mix turning to dust in my clenched fist, because the music was impossible in a place this dead. There were no other cars on the road, no marked trails for miles, and the woods south of town were flat, dense, and utterly vacant of human life. Yet the melody swelled with the wet, heavy crackle of a needle dragging across warped vinyl, filling the void where the birds had been seconds before. I come to these woods to enforce order on a mind that refuses to quiet down. My life in town is a blur of noise and demands, so I retreat here to curate silence, to arrange the world until it behaves and the pressure in my skull recedes. That night, I had spent 40 minutes perfecting the campsite, aligning my gear with the compulsive precision that keeps me sane. My pocket knife rested exactly 2 inches to the right of my sleeping bag roll. The pepper spray sat mirrored on the left. My cooking utensils were bound in a tight, symmetrical bundle near the fire ring. Everything had its place, and every place was a promise that I was in control. The music mocked that promise with a lethargic, sickly pulse that made my stomach turn. I waited for the track to change, for a voice to shout, for the beam of another camper's flashlight to cut the gloom. 25 minutes passed, then 30, and the song simply looped, the same 40-second phrase repeating with a mechanical obsession that mirrored my own. The repetition wasn't casual, it was deliberate, a sonic cage tightening around the campsite, and the wet crackle in the audio sounded less like static and more like a ragged, fluid inhale. I told myself it was a prank, some kids with a speaker trying to spook the loner in the woods, but the sound had a physical weight, pressing against my eardrums until a high-pitched whine began to needle into my left ear. I grabbed my flashlight, the beam jittering in my hand, and realized too late that I had left my knife and spray in their designated spots. The urge to investigate warred with a primal instinct to run, but the loop was drilling into my skull, demanding I find the source. I stepped away from the fire, leaving my perfect circle of safety, and the darkness swallowed me whole. The forest floor was soft, muffling my boots, but the music seemed to vibrate through the soles of my feet. I walked for what felt like 20 minutes, the volume increasing not in loudness but in texture, the strings growing thicker, more visceral. My heart hammered a frantic rhythm against the waltz, and the whine in my ear sharpened into a pain that made my vision blur at the edges. I kept expecting to see the glow of a phone screen or the silhouette of a tent, but there was only the wall of pines and that relentless breathing melody. Then the beam of my flashlight caught something angular wedged behind the trunk of a massive oak. It was a speaker, a bulky rectangular box from the early 2000s, covered in grime and moss. No wires ran from it, no generator hummed nearby. It just sat there, propped up like an altar, blasting the loop into the empty dark. I swept the light in a wide arc, searching for the person who had placed it, but the woods were vacant, the shadows static and unyielding. The music was coming from the box, but the isolation felt staged, a set piece arranged for an audience of one. I stepped closer, the air around the speaker smelling faintly of ozone and copper. The front panel housed a worn LCD display glowing a sickly phosphorescent green. I expected to see a track number or a battery icon, but the screen displayed a running timer, 02433. I glanced at my wrist, and a cold knot tightened in my gut. My watch read 9:14 p.m., and I had arrived at the trailhead at exactly 7 p.m. The timer wasn't counting the song, it was counting me, tracking the precise duration of my presence in the woods. I reached out, my fingers hovering over the power button, hesitating as the whine in my ear spiked to a scream. The display flickered, the numbers jumping forward by a second, and I realized the timer was synchronized to my pulse, not the clock. This wasn't abandoned equipment, it was active, aware, and waiting for me to touch it. The loop repeated, the wet crackle popping loudly, and for a fraction of a second, the sound resolved into a guttural gasp right before the violins swelled again. I pressed the button, the music cut out instantly, leaving a silence so absolute it felt like pressure dropping in a cabin. My ears rang, straining for the rustle of leaves, the snap of a twig, anything to prove I wasn't alone. Nothing moved. The woods held their breath, and the green glow of the LCD display faded to black. I stood there for a long moment, the flashlight beam trembling on the dead speaker, waiting for the trap to spring. When no attack came, a wave of nauseating relief washed over me, and I turned back toward the camp, desperate to reclaim the order I had abandoned. The hike back felt longer, the darkness pressing closer now that the music was gone. I kept the flashlight beam low, scanning the ground, my mind racing through rationalizations to stave off the panic. Someone had hiked in earlier, set the speaker as a joke, and left. The timer was just a glitch, a random coincidence my anxious brain had latched onto. I rehearsed these lies with every step, needing them to be true, needing the world to make sense again. But the silence wasn't peaceful. It was watchful, and the whine in my left ear had settled into a dull, throbbing ache. When the orange glow of my campfire finally pierced the trees, my shoulders dropped, and I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. The fire had burned down to embers, casting long, dancing shadows across my meticulously arranged site. I stepped into the circle of light, ready to stoke the flames and bury the night in heat and noise. Then I stopped, the air leaving my lungs as my beam swept over the sleeping bag. The order was broken. My knife was gone. The pepper spray was gone. The bundle of utensils had vanished, leaving only a smooth patch of dirt where they had rested. I dropped to my knees, raking my hands through the leaves, tearing at the ground as if the items had simply sunk into the earth. They hadn't been knocked aside or scattered by an animal. They had been lifted, removed with a care that left no trace of disturbance. Someone had been here, inside my sanctuary, while I was walking toward the speaker, and they had taken the tools I used to protect myself. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The music hadn't been a prank. It was a lure, a distraction designed to pull me away from the camp so the thief could work undisturbed. I scrambled up, spinning in a circle, the flashlight beam slicing wildly through the dark, but the woods offered no answers. My vulnerability was absolute. I was alone, unarmed, and someone was watching me with enough patience to orchestrate this. I needed to leave immediately, but my hands shook so violently I could barely grip the straps of my pack. As I shoved my sleeping bag into the stuff sack, the music started again. It didn't fade in, it snapped on, instant and deafening, but this time the source was wrong. The waltz wasn't coming from the direction of the speaker. It was closer, much closer, drifting from the dense brush just 20 yards behind my campsite. The wet crackle was louder now, the breathing unmistakable, a ragged inhale syncing perfectly with the swell of the strings. They weren't at the speaker. They had never been at the speaker, and now they were hurting me. I abandoned the tent, grabbing only my pack and the flashlight, and bolted toward the trail. The music followed, not moving through the trees, but jumping, the volume spiking and dropping as if the source were leaping from shadow to shadow. I ran blindly, branches whipping my face, my boots slipping on the soft pine needles, the waltz twisting into a grotesque parody of a chase theme. The whine in my ear screamed, and I realized with horror that the high-pitched tone was matching the frequency of the music, binding my body to the sound. Beneath the melody, I heard a soft thudding that matched my stride but lagged by a half second. I told myself it was an echo, but the ground was too soft for echoes. The lag persisted, a shadow sound mimicking my flight, and when I stopped for a split second to adjust my grip, the thudding continued for one extra step before halting. I didn't look back. I couldn't, because if I acknowledged the presence, the fragile logic holding me together would shatter. I ran faster, and the lagging footsteps accelerated, closing the gap until I could feel a displacement of air against my neck. I hit the trail and sprinted, my lungs burning, the beam of my flashlight bouncing erratically ahead of me. The music began to fade, the volume dropping as I put distance between myself and the camp, and a sliver of hope pierced the terror. I was outrunning it. I was getting away, and once I reached the road, I would be safe. I forced my legs to pump harder, the rhythm of my footsteps clashing with the distant dying loop, until the woods fell silent once more. I slowed to a fast walk, gasping for air, sweat stinging my eyes, and checked my watch. 15 minutes had passed since I fled the camp, and the silence was total. My pulse began to decelerate, and I allowed myself to believe the threat was behind me, anchored to that cursed speaker and the stolen gear. I kept my light trained on the path, watching for roots and rocks, my mind already constructing the story I would tell the police. Then the beam caught something pale lying in the center of the trail, and a cold paralysis seized my legs, the muscles locking as if the dark had solidified around my ankles. My gear lay arranged across the dirt path with a precision that made my stomach heave. The knife, the pepper spray, the utensils, they were not dumped or scattered, but lined up in a perfect row, spaced with mathematical exactness. I stepped closer, the flashlight beam trembling over the objects, and saw that the alignment mirrored my campsite ritual down to the inch. The knife was on the right. The spray was on the left. The utensils were bound tight, but the knot was different, tighter, more secure than I could ever tie it. The message was clear, and it stripped away the last of my denial. This was not a random predator playing with food. This was something that had studied me, learned my compulsions, and was now reflecting them back with superior mastery. The stalker wasn't just watching. They were inside my head, anticipating my need for order and weaponizing it against me. The items were a gift, a taunt, and a demonstration that my control was an illusion granted by their permission. I reached for the knife, my fingers hovering over the handle, desperate to reclaim some fragment of safety. Before I could touch the metal, the wet crackle erupted from the darkness directly behind me. It wasn't the speaker. It was a throat, a human throat amplifying that ragged fluid inhale close enough to stir the hair on my neck. I spun around, swinging the flashlight, but the beam caught only the empty trail and the wall of trees. The sound had been intimate, immediate, yet there was no one there, and the realization fractured my perception of space. The presence wasn't behind me. It was everywhere, woven into the dark, and the footsteps I had heard lagging behind me had never been echoes. I turned and ran, leaving the gear where it lay, because taking it would mean accepting the game, and I knew instinctively that the moment I picked up that knife, the rules would shift. I sprinted until my legs burned and my vision tunneled, the silence of the woods now more terrifying than the music, because the silence felt like a held breath waiting for me to make a mistake. I didn't look back. I didn't slow down. I ran with the singular, animal focus of prey that knows the predator is done toying and ready to strike. I burst out of the tree line and onto the gravel road, my car a dark shape in the moonlight, and fumbled for my keys with numb, shaking hands. I threw myself into the driver's seat, locked the doors, and cranked the engine, the headlights cutting a safe, artificial swath through the night. As I sped away, the woods receding in the rearview mirror, I felt the tension begin to unspool, replaced by a hollow, trembling exhaustion. I had escaped. I had broken the loop, and the gear, the speaker, and the stalker were left behind in the dark. That was 2016, and I have never returned to those woods, never hiked a trail without a weapon, never allowed myself to be alone in the quiet. I told myself the distance was enough, that the horror was contained within that flat, dense patch of forest south of town. But the loop does not end just because you leave the room. It waits, patient and obsessive, for the conditions to align again. 3 days ago, I woke to the sound of a wet, ragged inhale coming from the baby monitor in the nursery, though we do not have a baby, and the house was empty. I walked into the kitchen, my pulse throbbing a violent, erratic beat against my throat, and found my knife, my pepper spray, and a bundle of utensils arranged on the counter. They were spaced with mathematical exactness, the knot on the utensils tighter than I could ever tie, and the alignment was perfect. The whine in my left ear returned, sharp and screaming, and beneath it, faint but undeniable, the first notes of the waltz began to swell. I turned the speaker off in the woods, but the timer never reset, and now I understand the display wasn't counting my time in the forest. It was counting down to this moment. The music is not coming from the monitor. It is coming from the walls, from the floor, from the blood rushing in my ears, and the wet crackle is syncing with my own breathing. I am not the narrator of this story. I am the track, and the needle has just dropped again. The woods did not follow me home. I brought the woods with me, curated and aligned, and the stalker was never a person in the dark. The stalker is the loop, and I have spent 8 years arranging my life exactly as it wanted, preparing the stage for the final repetition. I look at my hands, and they are trembling not with fear, but with the urge to adjust the knife, to nudge it a millimeter to the right, to perfect the arrangement. The compulsion is overwhelming, a physical itch in my brain, and I realize the stalker didn't just learn my rituals. The stalker fed them, amplified them, until my need for order became the beacon that guided it here. I am reaching for the knife now, not to defend myself, but to align it, because if I can just get everything perfect, the music might stop. But I know it won't, because the timer is still running, and the waltz demands a dancer.